The 9,000th and 16th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is Women and Peace and Security, Accountability as Prevention, Ending Cycles of Sexual Violence in Conflict. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Algeria, Argentina, Australia, Austria, Bangladesh, Belgium, Bulgaria, Canada, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Croatia, Cyprus, Czech Republic, Denmark, Ecuador, Estonia, Ethiopia, Georgia, Germany, Greece, Indonesia, Iraq, the Islamic Republic of Iran, Italy, Japan, Jordan, Latvia, Lebanon, Liechtenstein, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Malaysia, Maldives, Malta, Morocco, Nepal, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Poland, Portugal, the Republic of Korea, Sierra Leone, Saudi Arabia, Slovakia, Slovenia, South Africa, Spain, Sri Lanka, Sweden, Switzerland, Turkey, Ukraine, and Yemen to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Ms. Pramila Patten, Special Representative on Sexual Violence in Conflict, the UN, Ms. Nadia Murad, Nobel Peace Prize Laureate and UNODC Goodwill Ambassador, Ms. Marina Kakutli, co-founder of Hukukat, and Ms. Helena Berhanu, Civil Society Briefer. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite the following to participate in this meeting. His Excellency, Mr. Olof Skog, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, and Mr. Mikhail Miaka, Head of the NATO Liaison Office to the United Nations. It is so decided. I propose that the Council invite the permanent observer of the Observer State of the Holy See to the United Nations to participate in the meeting in accordance with the Provisional Rules of Procedure and the previous practice in this regard. There being no objection, it is decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of Council members to document S/2022/272, the report of the Secretary-General on conflict-related sexual violence, and document S/2022/293, a letter dated the 5th of April 2022 from the Permanent Representative of the United Kingdom to the United Nations, addressed to the Secretary-General, transmitting a concept paper on the item under consideration. With that, we move to the main agenda, and I now give the floor to Ms. Pramila Patten. SRSG, the floor is yours.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, I would like to begin my remarks today with a question that should be on the mind of every member of this Council. What do the 10 resolutions on women, peace, and security, 5 of which squarely on preventing and addressing conflict-related sexual violence, mean right now for a woman in Ukraine, Afghanistan, Myanmar, or Tigray? Every new wave of warfare brings with it a rising tide of human tragedy, including new waves of war's oldest, most silenced, and least condemned crime. And yet, the promise expressed by this Council in its resolutions is prevention. They represent a commitment to bring all tools to bear to break the seemingly endless cycles of sexual violence, impunity, and revenge in order to save succeeding generations from this scourge. They articulate the elements of an accountability regime to influence the conduct of perpetrators and potential perpetrators. In that respect, I would like to sincerely appreciate the leadership of the United Kingdom in convening this debate on accountability as prevention. I thank Lord Ahmad and the United Kingdom's Preventing Sexual Violence Initiative for shining and sustaining a spotlight on this atrocity during dark and difficult times. I warmly welcome the civil society briefers from Syria and Ethiopia, as well as Nobel laureate Mrs. Nadia Murad from Iraq. The lived experience of survivors and directly affected communities must guide our global search for solutions. Excellencies, we meet at a time of great global turbulence, marked by multiple cascading crises. When the pandemic emptied this chamber over 2 years ago, the Secretary General called for a global ceasefire to defeat the common enemy of disease. The pandemic was meant to usher in a paradigm shift, to silence the guns and amplify the voices of women caregivers and peace builders, to deepen investment in public welfare rather than the instruments of warfare. Instead, we have seen increased militarization, including an epidemic of coups, which have turned back the clock on women's rights. New crises have multiplied, even as entrenched wars march on, exacerbating the challenge of shrinking, in some cases closing civic space, manifest in rising reprisals against women's human rights defenders, activists, and journalists who risk their lives to bring these issues to the attention of the world. Reprisals have been used against frontline actors working to end sexual violence and deliver life-saving services. And sexual violence itself has been used as a tool of reprisal and intimidation, coupled with misogynistic hate speech, including online. This affects the wider political climate when those who should be praised for their courage are instead persecuted. In virtual meetings over many months, on many screens, we endeavored to ensure that survivors of wartime rape would not be forgotten in the long shadow cast by COVID-19. Today, as the world watches, transfixed by the horrors unfolding in Ukraine, with its wider ripple effects on global stability, other crises continue to escalate behind the scenes. The bandwidth of our global attention economy is limited. As the Secretary General has rightly stated, the world is too small for so many hotspots. We must reassure all populations at risk that they are not forgotten and that international law is not an empty promise. In my public statements on Ukraine, I have urged all parties to the conflict to ensure the protection of women and girls from sexual violence, trafficking, and exploitation, including those displaced internally and across borders, following the fastest population flight this century. I have expressed grave concern about the mounting allegations of sexual violence and called for swift and rigorous investigations to ensure accountability as a central aspect of deterrence, prevention, and non-repetition. The failure to acknowledge and investigate past atrocities is the surest sign that violations will continue unabated. All the warning signs are flashing red, and yet essential civilian infrastructure has been reduced to rubble and ruin. Gender-based violence and reproductive health services are least available just when they are needed most. We do not need hard data for a scaled-up humanitarian response. We do not need hard data for all parties to ensure zero tolerance for sexual violence. The harrowing personal testimonies and pictures seen around the world, including of rape at gunpoint and rape in front of family members, are a call to action. The report before us today surfaces painful human stories, all of which cry out for justice and redress. In northern Ethiopia, a young woman was taken to an Eritrean Defense Forces camp where 27 soldiers raped her, as a result of which she contracted HIV. An elderly, visually impaired woman was shot by soldiers after being detained for 3 days while her daughter was raped by members of the Ethiopian National Defense Forces in an adjacent room. An adolescent boy was raped in Himora, who later committed suicide. There's also the case of a woman and 2 girls whose discarded bodies were found days after their kidnapping and rape by armed elements in the Central African Republic, where sexual violence has doubled over the past year, particularly against displaced populations who are at risk of being forgotten victims of a forgotten war. Likewise, the plight of over 900,000 Rohingya refugees in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh, has become a crisis within a crisis, following the military takeover of Myanmar by the Tatmadaw. This year's report includes the tragic case of 2 women subjected to gang rape by Tatmadaw soldiers in Chin State, resulting in unwanted pregnancies in both cases. There is also the case of a woman allegedly raped at gunpoint by an officer of the Puntland police force in Somalia, a context where abduction, rape, and forced marriage are rampant, while legislative reform to address these crimes has been stalled since 2018. In Colombia, cases of sexual violence committed against women ex-combatants and members of their families were also documented. In Afghanistan, professional women, including in the security sector, have been targeted for their work to address sexual violence, with a female police officer who was 8 months pregnant, brutally tortured and killed in Gore province. Thousands of civilians abducted by Daesh in Iraq and Syria between 2014 and 2017 remain in captivity, including victims of forced marriage and sexual slavery. In Yemen, harmful social norms exacerbated by 7 years of armed conflict can result in a victim being killed for reporting rape, which persists in detention facilities and displacement settings. In each of these contexts, we see the emboldening effects of impunity. Indeed, the gap between commitments and compliance, resolutions and reality is evident on every page of the annual report. Over the past year, sexual violence continued to be committed as a tactic of war, torture, terrorism, and political repression. The report covers 18 country situations and documents 3,293 UN-verified cases of conflict-related sexual violence committed in 2021, representing a significant increase of some 800 cases compared with 2020. Once again, the highest number of incidents was recorded in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, with 1,016 cases. The vast majority of incidents targeted women and girls, 97%. 83 cases were recorded against men and boys, with the majority occurring in detention settings. 12 verified cases were found to target LGBTQI individuals. The report demonstrates how intersecting forms of inequality based on ethnic identity, political affiliation, age, disability, sexual orientation and gender identity, income, and migratory status increase the risk faced by diverse individuals in a context of historical power imbalances, which are structural and systemic. While the report conveys the severity of verified incidents, no report can capture the full scale and prevalence of this chronically underreported, historically hidden crime. Indeed, survivors continue to be silenced by trauma, pain, and despair, as well as by stigma, insecurity, and the paucity of service provision. There is a relationship between the individual silence and the official silence. Survivors cannot be expected to denounce what the state itself denies. When the perpetrators walk free, the survivors walk in fear, carrying the burden of ostracism and shame. The central insight of this year's report is the need to foster a protective environment that inhibits sexual violence in the first instance and enables safe reporting and response. These are not isolated incidents. They do not occur in a vacuum. Today, we know more than ever before about the security dynamics that cause these crimes to occur and recur, namely mass population displacement, collapsed rule of law, decimated infrastructure and institutions, rising violent extremism, and hostilities waged in proximity to civilian population centers. It is also starkly evident across the world that lawlessness and impunity are tantamount to license to rape. We are aware of the visible drivers, such as arms proliferation, and the invisible drivers, such as gender-based discrimination. We know the context in which sexual violence is concentrated, namely in displacement, detention, at checkpoints, on military bases, and in rural areas where women undertake livelihood activities. And we know that socioeconomically marginalized women in areas beyond the reach of law institutions are at greatest risk. What is this? What is this? May I continue, Mr. President?
Yes. I think if we could just request everyone to put their phones, I think that was an Amber Alert warning, but SRSG, please continue.
Thank you. Prosecution, Mr. President, is also a form of prevention and can help to convert the centuries-old culture of impunity for these crimes into a culture of deterrence. Whereas impunity normalizes violence, justice reinforces global norms. It is time to move from visibility to accountability and to ensure that today's documentation translates into tomorrow's prosecutions. The prohibition on sexual violence is clear and categorical, yet norms have no power unless they are known. Every member of this council can lead the way in reflecting that prohibition in their military manuals, international humanitarian law dissemination and training, codes of conduct, and military disciplinary measures at all levels of the chain of command. We have said for several years in this chamber that sexual violence is preventable, not inevitable. It is time now to make accountability inevitable. Survivors must be seen by their societies as the holders of rights that will be respected and enforced. And societies must realize that the only shame of rape is in committing, commanding, or condoning it. In 2021, 4 encouraging developments took place in terms of transitional justice. Firstly, in Guatemala, 5 former members of the paramilitary group, the Civil Self-Defense Patrols, were convicted and sentenced for crimes of sexual violence committed against indigenous Maya Achi women in the 1980s. Secondly, in Iraq, the Council of Representatives adopted the Yazidi Survivors Law, which provides support to victims of Daesh atrocities. Thirdly, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights issued a ruling that found the state responsible for violations of the rights of Colombian journalist Mrs. Ginette Bedoya Lima, following her 2-decade quest for justice for abduction and sexual abuse. Yesterday, I was pleased to announce Mrs. Bedoya's appointment as one of my mandate's global champions for the prevention of conflict-related sexual violence. Fourth, under the auspices of universal jurisdiction, a former official of the Syrian General Intelligence Service, Anwar R., was convicted by the Higher Regional Court in Koblenz, Germany, for crimes against humanity, including sexual violence committed in 2011 and 2012. Each year, we report 3 or 4 landmark judgments against the backdrop of thousands of UN-verified cases that meet the elements of international crimes. Accordingly, I regret to note that the few emblematic cases of justice delivered are still the exception that prove the rule of justice denied. In June 2021, my office launched model legislative provisions and guidance on the investigation and prosecution of conflict-related sexual violence, which aims to ensure that the national legislation comprehensively criminalizes all forms of sexual violence and protects all individuals at risk. This guidance supports implementation of Security Council Resolution 2467 of 2019, which calls on member states to strengthen legislation and enhance investigation and prosecution of sexual violence in order to deliver justice that is accessible, empowering, and ultimately transformative in line with the survivor-centered approach. Yet, accountability processes, while critical, are no substitute for compliance with international norms in the first instance. This year's report lists 49 parties credibly suspected of committing or being responsible for patterns of sexual violence in situations of the agenda of the Council. Over 70% are persistent perpetrators, having appeared in the list for 5 or more years without taking remedial or corrective action. It is critical, Mr. President, to cohere the practice of listing suspected perpetrators and the practice of imposing targeted and graduated measures by sanctions committees to improve compliance. Leveraging the credible threat of sanctions can change the calculation of parties to conflict that operate on the assumption that rape is cost-free or even profitable in the political economy of war, in which women and girls are trafficked, traded, and sold. 8 sanctions regimes now include sexual violence as part of their designation criteria. In 2021, the 1970 Committee on Libya listed the de facto manager of the notorious Al-Nasser detention center for abuses, including sexual violence. Excellencies, distinguished members of the Security Council, in terms of the way forward, the report recommends targeted action to reinforce structural prevention through political and diplomatic engagements to address sexual violence in ceasefire and peace agreements, the use of early warning indicators of sexual violence to inform monitoring, threat analysis, and early response, curtailing the flow of small arms and light weapons, gender-responsive justice and security sector reform, including vetting, training, codes of conduct, zero-tolerance policies, and effective prosecutions, amplifying the voices of survivors and affected communities, and supporting women's human rights defenders, as well as victims and witnesses. Justice, peace, and security are inextricably linked. Collaboration between this Council and the Peacebuilding Commission can advance gender-responsive accountability and reconciliation processes which address crimes of sexual violence as part of the consolidation of peace. We must deliver justice, not just law, in communities as well as courtrooms, and ensure that reparations reach survivors to help them rebuild shattered lives and livelihoods. It is critical that member states reinforce the architecture established by this Council through Resolution 1888, including the team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence in conflict that works to strengthen institutional safeguards against impunity, the interagency coordination network, UN Action Against Sexual Violence in Conflict, and women's protection advisors, whose timely deployment to the field is vital for timely reporting and response. We must marshal a level of resolve and resources equal to the scale of the challenge, including by replenishing the conflict-related sexual violence multi-partner trust fund that supports our work. Our special report on women and girls who become pregnant as a result of sexual violence in conflict and children born of sexual violence in conflict, circulated in January, also sets out a platform of legal, policy, and operational recommendations, including reforming discriminatory nationality laws and practices. I look forward to the special report being debated by the Council later this year. Excellencies, the UN Charter was born of war, to chart the path to peace. No amount of protection or assistance is a substitute for peace. As a wise woman once said, you can no more win a war than an earthquake. Wars are indeed unwinnable, and yet their social and economic aftershocks affect us all. Throughout history, human progress has been interrupted by plagues, wars, and authoritarian rule. Issues we thought had been consigned to the ash heap of history remain in our daily headlines. We cannot choose the times we live in. We can only choose how we respond. We must not rest until every survivor, every civilian can sleep under the cover of justice. There is no place in the modern world for gender apartheid, for strong men in place of strong institutions, or for medieval wars of looting, pillage, and rape. Women's rights are not Western rights. They are human rights, and they are universal in times of war and peace. Prevention is the best form of protection, including the prevention of conflict itself. We must rise to the challenge of our times. Inaction is not an option. Thank you, Mr. President.
I wish to thank Ms. Pramila Patten for a very extensive and detailed report. And if I could just make a request for my role as chair of this particular meeting, if you could please ensure this is a very important subject, and the testimonies, particularly from some of our survivors, and in accordance with due respect, I would ask you once again to please check your phones so that we can then proceed with the proceedings. With that, it's my great honor to now give the floor to Ms. Nadia Murad. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you as well to Ambassador Woodward and to the United Kingdom for organizing this important debate as one of your signature events, and for inviting me to brief today. Ladies, gentlemen, and dear friends, we are gathered at a moment of global instability, a moment shaped by pandemic, war, and a climate crisis. In times like this, issues that affect women and girls, issues like conflict-related sexual violence, tend to be pushed aside, as though they are somehow secondary to the real issues. But the truth is, these are precisely the moments when protecting, supporting, and investing in women and girls should be urgent priorities. For every setback our societies face, women and girls are forced 10 steps back. This is particularly true in times of conflict. History shows that whenever armed conflict erupts anywhere in the world, rape and brutality follow. We are seeing this in Ukraine as we speak, with reports of sexual violence that should alarm us all. Sexual violence is not a side effect of conflict. It is a tactic of war as old as time. Groups like ISIS understand the destabilizing effect of gender-based violence, and so must we. ISIS began targeting my Yazidi community in 2014. Thousands of Yazidis were massacred. Others fled on foot, facing thirst, starvation, and blistering temperatures. In addition to the murders, ISIS captured more than 6,000 Yazidi women and children. Women and girls like me, my nieces, and my sisters were sold and raped. Those of us who survived were considered lucky. But the nightmare continues even now, 8 years later, for more than 2,800 women and children who are still living in captivity and sexual violence at the hands of ISIS. We are here today to discuss accountability, not only in the aftermath of conflict-related sexual violence, but importantly as a tool to prevent such violence from occurring in the first place. In particular, there is 3 aspects of accountability I would like to highlight: justice, support for survivors, and a commitment to gender equity in the long term. The pursuit of justice is one of the most visible forms of accountability. Last year, a German court convicted an ISIS member of genocide. It was the first time this had ever happened anywhere in the world. This historic verdict is an important step. But standing before you today, my question is, what next? ISIS led a systemic campaign of sexual violence to destroy Yazidi women and the Yazidi community. The United Nations has condemned their actions as genocide. UNITAD has collected reams of evidence documenting the atrocities ISIS committed against women and girls. And other terrorist groups and oppressive regimes have watched as ISIS members openly brag about enslaving Yazidi women and girls while facing few, if any, consequences on the world stage. As survivors of sexual violence, it is not easy for us to tell our stories. But we do it to prevent what happened to us from happening to others. We are called brave, but the courage we really want to see is from leaders in a position to do something, whether they are heads of state, member states here at the UN, or corporate leaders. We need more than moral outrage. We need action. To those of you assembled in this chamber, now is your moment to put ISIS on trials for genocide and sexual violence. Send the case to the International Criminal Court, or establish a hybrid court by treaty to prosecute ISIS crimes. In the meantime, other nations should follow Germany's example. and use the principle of universal jurisdiction to try war criminals for the atrocities they commit, including sexual violence. These trials must proceed with transparency for survivors who deserve their day in court. What message it will send if violent perpetrators of sexual violence continue to enjoy immunity? If you want to establish deterrence, if you want to assure Yazidi women and survivors everywhere that you stand with us, do not delay justice anymore. We have the evidence. All we need is the political will. Accountability means that those who perpetrate violence should face consequences for their actions. But it cannot stop there. Victims are not to blame for sexual violence. Yet, too often we are left to piece our lives back together on our own, abandoned by the government and the international communities that felt in their mandate to protect the basic human rights of all people. Survivors need solidarity and tangible support to empower them and provide a path to recovery. Reparations and recognition are an essential part of justice. That is why I have co-founded the Global Survivors Fund with my friend and colleague, Dr. Dennis Mukwege, to provide interim reparations to survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. After all, to survivors, reparations are not some theoretical idea or a topic for legal debate. They are the difference between going hungry and having enough food to put on the table, between sustaining lifelong injuries and accessing reproductive health care, between being cast out of our communities and being able to put a roof over our heads. Through this project, we want survivors to know that we stand with them and they are not alone. 8 years after ISIS genocide, survivors who returned to Sinjar are still struggling to recover in the face of political disputes between Baghdad and Erbil, with militia groups vying for control of our homeland. The UN Security Council should send a special envoy to end the suffering of Yazidis in Iraq. Member states have a moral responsibility not to abandon genocide survivors. This brings me to my third point. Every time we see a new conflict, there is an outpouring of thoughts and prayer. But as I know from personal experience, a few days or even a week in the news cycle does nothing to address the systemic challenges women face. This is true from Iraq to Ethiopia, to the Democratic Republic of Congo, to Ukraine, to conflict zones everywhere. It is not enough to talk about accountability and prevention in times of crisis. We need long-term commitments to advancing global gender equity, because gender equity is key to democracy. That means combating gender bias and stereotypes everywhere they occur, in homes and families, as well as in our education system. And it means recognizing that what is true in times of conflict is true in times of peace. If we want strong, stable communities, we must listen to women. To be very clear, when I say listen to women, I do not mean this in some abstract way. I mean that policymakers should leave the halls of power and go out into affected communities and ask women what they need. One solution will not work for everyone. Throughout the world, different socioeconomic and political circumstances impact women's rights. Compounding factors such as race, religion, class, and access to healthcare, education, and employment require different solutions. Survivors know best what they need to heal and recover, so why not ask them? At Nadia's initiative, the organization I founded, we see every day that the most effective work is community-led, survivor-centered, and takes a holistic approach. The work that is being done to help survivors must be done hand in hand with them. It is not just the act of listening that matters. How you listen, the way you communicate with survivors, and what you do with the information you collect. All of these things matter too. Documenting sexual violence is crucial for accountability and prevention. But too often, survivors who speak out face shame, stigma, and lack of transparency about how our testimonies will or will not be used, or the likely outcomes. That is why I look forward to joining Lord Ahmed tomorrow to officially announce the Murad Code, a set of guidelines intended to change norms around how journalists, investigators, and anyone tasked with documenting and investigating conflict-related sexual violence interacts with survivors. These guidelines were shaped by feedback from survivors around the globe and aim to promote greater respect, understanding, transparency, and healing. In conclusion, accountability can be a crucial component of prevention, but only if it includes meaningful justice. The services and support survivors need, and the ultimate goal of advancing global gender equity. Each of you in this room has the power to make this a reality, only if you choose to act. Everywhere I go, I meet survivors of sexual violence who are bravely telling their stories in the face of stigma, shame, and even physical danger. If women who have suffered such immense loss and incredible pain can find the strength to not only rebuild our lives, but help our families, communities, and entire countries, surely the rest of the world can find the strength to take meaningful steps to end sexual violence in conflict. As survivors, we look to you, the leaders in this room, to act with the same courage we have shown. Survivors do not want pity. We want justice. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I thank, on behalf of all of us, Ms. Nadia Murad for her deep insights and her continuing courage and strength on this important issue. Thank you, Ms. Murad, for your briefing. It's now my honor to invite and give the floor to Ms. Mariana Karakutli. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Mr. President, Excellencies, civil society colleagues. My name is Mariana Karakutli, and I'm a co-founder of Huquqiyat, a membership-based organization of women lawyers and legal practitioners advocating for accountability in Syria. Thank you for the opportunity to deliver this statement today. Mr. President, let me start by saying that what drove me to study law was not love of the law, but the experience of injustice. While studying law under a dictatorship did not teach me much, witnessing women in Syria fighting for their rights did. Accountability, the theme of this open debate, is a difficult word to say in the Syrian context. We have experienced all sorts of atrocities for over a decade, with more than 350,000 people killed, tens of thousands arbitrarily detained or disappeared, nearly 13 million displaced, and another 14 million in need of humanitarian assistance. Parties to the conflict have violated international human rights and humanitarian law, used chemical weapons, and committed acts that amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. Government forces and armed groups continue to murder, torture, and use sexual and gender-based violence against civilians as a matter of policy. Yet, despite discussing Syria for more than a decade, this Council has failed to take actions to hold perpetrators accountable. The Syrian government has systematically violated not only international law, but many of the Security Council's own resolutions. Meanwhile, members of this Council has blocked urgent actions on Syria, shielded the Syrian regime from accountability, and vetoed resolutions on humanitarian assistance and investigating the use of chemical weapons against civilians 16 times. My statement today will focus on 3 issues: the use of sexual violence against women, entrenched gender discrimination in Syria, and next steps from the international community to ensure accountability. As documented by the UN Commission of Inquiry on Syria, sexual and gender-based violence has been used against civilians during ground operations, at checkpoints, and in detention across the country since 2011, primarily by government forces and associated militia, but also other armed groups. It has been called a devastating and pervasive feature of the Syrian conflict and part of a widespread and systematic attack against civilians, amounting to crimes against humanity. This violence continues as we speak. I have worked as an independent investigator with the support of the Center for Justice and Accountability since 2020 on case building against members of the Assad regime responsible for crimes against civilians. To date, we have documented 54 testimonies, including of survivors of sexual violence. These are just some of the hundreds that have been documented out of tens of thousands of survivors. Over the last decade, at least 150,000 people in Syria are estimated to have been arbitrarily arrested, detained, or disappeared. At least 9,700 women still are. These women, lawyers, journalists, activists, and others have been detained for opposing the regime, or often to punish or threaten male relatives who have. In places of detention, sexual violence is used to humiliate them, to punish them for rebelling, and to force confessions. Women in detention have been subject to all kinds of sexual violence, including rape, torture, sexual harassment, electric shocks directed at genital areas, intimate searches, forced abortions, and forced nudity. Survivors of rape and sexual violence in detention, estimated to number in the thousands, have largely been unable to report these crimes for fear of marginalization or further retaliation. Discrimination and violence against women and girls who have been detained or who have faced sexual violence has resulted in abandonment, divorce, so-called honor killings, and suicide. The Syrian regime has taken advantage of this. They knew that by targeting women in this way, they were in fact targeting their communities as a whole. This is why arresting and detaining women, leaving their families with no information about their fate, has been a key tool used to suppress Syrian descent since 2011. The systematic occurrence of these crimes across the country provides reasonable grounds to assert that the regime has weaponized gender-based violence as a matter of state policy. The Syrian regime's actions have been possible because of a corrupt legal system and entrenched discrimination against women and girls in Syria, which impacts their access to housing, land, property rights, custody of their children, as well as their protection. For instance, laws in Syria do not criminalize sexual or gender-based violence against women or marital rape. Syrian women cannot pass their nationality to their children, and even where laws have changed, social practices have not. Furthermore, sexual and gender-based violence against women does not end inside Syria, but continues in the camps, settlements, and cities throughout the region, where millions of Syrian refugees face discrimination, poverty, and lack of access to healthcare and education, all while experiencing pressure to return to a country that is not yet safe. Syrians are desperate for justice after more than a decade of war. Domestic accountability is impossible as long as the Assad regime remains in power. The universal jurisdiction cases currently being pursued against suspects for crimes committed in Syria, while positive, have also had limits, including how fear of retaliation for reporting to local authorities and the trauma and stigmatization of survivors of sexual violence impact the ability and willingness of victims to come forward. Mr. President, Syrians can no longer wait for justice. We encourage all UN member states to continue to pursue accountability under universal jurisdiction. But we are also looking to you, the Security Council, for help by referring the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court. Despite 14 years of this Council's condemnation of the use of sexual violence in conflict, impunity prevails, not only in Syria, but in many other conflicts on this Council's agenda. This is often not because sexual violence has been inadequately criminalized or because perpetrators are unknown, but due to a lack of political courage. The Security Council must call on the Syrian government to respect international law, end attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure, and ensure an immediate, permanent nationwide ceasefire. Immediately end torture, inhumane treatment, and sexual violence, including in places of arrest and detention. Release all arbitrarily detained persons. Allow unconditional access to all places of detention by international humanitarian organizations. Release the names, status, and locations of all detainees and a timetable of their release. To you, the Security Council, member states, and the UN, I urge you to refer the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court. Adopt a resolution on the situation of detainees and missing persons that underlines the Syrian government's obligations under international law and reflects the priorities outlined by associations representing victims, survivors, and their families, such as the Truth and Justice Charter, including support for creation of a mechanism to clarify the fate of missing persons and supporting their families. Investigate and prosecute all perpetrators of sexual violence and ensure women's rights are at the core of all accountability efforts. Ensure women's full, equal, and meaningful participation in all ongoing and future political, peace, or reconciliation processes. Prioritize a survivor-centered and right-based approach to prevention and mitigation of gender-based violence. Ensure that the Special Envoy for Syria prioritizes human rights and international humanitarian law, including arbitrary detention, enforced disappearance, torture, and gender-based violence in political discussions. That he convenes Syrian civil society on how to address these issues and regularly briefs the Security Councils on these efforts. Renew the cross-border mechanism for at least 12 months and reauthorize access via all original crossing points. Cross-border access is an indispensable lifeline for millions of people in Syria, the majority of whom are women and children. Pressure arms exporting countries to stop arms proliferation and prevent the use of weapons against all civilians. When people in Syria watch conflicts rage in Ukraine and other parts of the world, today, we are reminded of our own suffering and the abject failure of this body to stop the violence. I join my voice with those of millions of girls and women from Syria who are not here with me today and call on you to take action. There can be no peace without justice. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Karkutli for a very powerful statement. I now give the floor to Ms. Helena Berhanu. The floor is yours.
Mr. President, distinguished representatives of member states, and honored attendees, thank you for allowing me to bring the stories of Ethiopian women to the chamber of the Security Council. I speak to you today as an Ethiopian woman, one who has heard these testimonies and seen this injured firsthand in Tigray, one who carries the guilt of survival in silence. Today, I hope to do justice to the experience of millions of Ethiopian women who've suffered in this war. In this briefing, I'll focus on 6 points in relation to conflict-related sexual violence in Ethiopia since the war began in Tigray in November 2020 and expanded to neighboring regions of Amhara and Afar. These points are directly drawn from human rights investigations and reports that have been made public, as well as on my own visits to the region. First, rape has been perpetrated systematically and used as a tactic of war. It is framed as a means of reprisal and leveraged as a bonding tool for members of allied military forces. When the war first started, Blaine, a 21-year-old waitress from Badime, along with 30 other Tigrayan women, was held against her will and subjected to sexual slavery, starvation, and gang rape by a group of Eritrean and Ethiopian soldiers who took turns with her. I documented many other stories like Blaine's during multiple visits to the region of Tigray before June 2021. Sexual violence was used to terrorize communities as a bonding tool amongst allied Eritrean Defense Forces, Ethiopian National Defense Force, Amhara Regional Militia, and special forces through the shared experiences of exploiting women's bodies. The consistency across victims' accounts show that these crimes were committed intentionally with a degree of organization and planning. Second, sexual violence is ethnically motivated. A Tigrayan woman was fleeing the conflict zone with her children. Along the way, she encountered the Amhara militia, who separated her from her family, gang raped her, and inserted a hot metal rod into her uterus. They declared, a Tigrayan should never give birth. Similar incidents of rape with claims of cleansing Tigrayan blood and mutilating women's bodies to prevent the birth of more generations of Tigrayans have been extensively covered by different human rights reports. And third, sexual violence is used to humiliate survivors and their communities. Sexual violence has often been perpetrated in front of family members. An Amhara woman was beaten and raped in the presence of her husband and a child by 2 Tigrayan force members. She and her children witnessed her husband being killed as she tried to stop the assault. Men and boys were also sexually assaulted. The Ethiopian Human Rights Commission found in Samra, town of Tigray, 600 men and boys were stripped and forcibly paraded, some completely naked, while Eritrean female soldiers mocked them and took pictures. And fourth, women with disabilities and other vulnerable communities have been at particular risk during this conflict. Many women with disabilities were specifically targeted in the region of Tigray, as they were presumed to be fighters of the previous war. Girls, elderly women, and women belonging to minority and indigenous communities also face higher risks. The lack of access to the region for independent human rights monitoring has made it difficult to document the impact of the conflict in minority communities, and especially those living in disputed areas on the Eritrean border, such as Europe and Kunama and Tigray. And fifth, the conflict in northern Ethiopia and the effective siege of the Tigray region in particular has undermined women's rights. including access to reproductive health care and psychosocial support, exacerbating the impacts of sexual violence. In May 2021, I visited a shelter supported by Mekelle University in Tigray, where many lactating mothers and their infants had taken refuge. These women, some of whom had survived sexual assault while being pregnant, could not access timely sexual and reproductive care, owed mainly to widespread destruction of medical facilities and limited deliveries of aid due to the government blockade of the region. The conflict in northern Ethiopia has increased women's vulnerabilities irrespective of their ethnicity. I carry with me the story of Khadija, a 9-month pregnant woman from Afar who fled the shelling of Abala town by Tigrayan Defense Forces with her 5 children and elderly mother. She gave birth under a tree after working for 9 days, 2 of which while in labor. In a country with one of the highest maternal mortality rates globally and lack of infrastructure, specifically in pastoral communities and areas, the conflict immediately puts the lives of many Ethiopian women in grave danger. Lack of access to psychosocial support services also means that the mental health of survivors hangs in the balance. Many have already died by suicide. The story of a 50-year-old Amhara woman from Shawa Robit in central Ethiopia who was gang raped by Tigrayan fighters in the presence of her son in the next room and later died of suicide highlights how tragic the situation is. Initial reports also indicate disproportionate rates of suicide amongst internally displaced persons across different parts of Tigray. And amid a total internet and telecom blackout, I fear the extent of the trauma felt by the community remains unknown. And 6, while cases of sexual violence from Tigray, Afar, and Amhara have attracted international attention, women from other communities across Ethiopia, specifically from that of the Oromo, Gumuz, Konso, Kamant, and Somali, specifically Ogaden, continue to experience conflict-related sexual violence, including by state forces, without any attention from the international community. Mr. President, members of the Council, the central theme of today's open debate is accountability for sexual violence. Security Council Resolution 2467 recalls the critical role of national investigations. The Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and UN Office for Human Rights were able to conduct a joint investigation, which was limited in scope and analysis. But unfortunately, and more broadly, we have witnessed deliberate delays of investigation, withholding of information, failings of the justice system, and destruction of evidence, including statistical records, and harassment and detention of journalists by the Ethiopian state and allied parties to the conflict. As we've seen in other contexts and in the spilling of this war into the broader northern region, lack of accountability and justice for past crimes continue to fuel a sense of grievances that drives a vicious cycle of retaliatory attacks. Based on the trends and the stories that I just highlighted, I would like to offer the following recommendations to the members of the Security Council. First, use your platform to demand that efforts to document, investigate, and prevent sexual violence and conflicts are survivor-centered and conducted in a dignified, safe, and confidential manner. As part of the pursuit of justice for survivors, the Security Council should also champion the work of the recently established International Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia, including by urging all parties to the conflict to fully cooperate and provide unimpeded access to the Commission. And second, the Council should demand that all parties ensure full and safe humanitarian access to Tigray and other areas of conflict, and ensure that humanitarian aid prioritizes the needs of survivors. This includes comprehensive sexual and reproductive health care and addressing stigma. Service providers must also continue to adhere to core humanitarian standards, including interagency standing committee guidelines on gender-based violence and mental health and psychosocial support. And finally, I call on the A3, the 3 African countries in the Security Council, who can be counted as some of the strongest voices of women, peace and security in this chamber. I urge them to work here and in the African Union through its Peace and Security Council, which has the mandate to request a proactive intervention from the AU Special Envoy on Women, Peace and Security, and to take a harder look at the prevailing view that supporting investigations of conflict-related sexual violence in Ethiopia could somehow derail the proposed reform agenda of the current government. Excellencies, this war has been so devastating to witness. First, because of the sheer scale of human suffering, and second, because many Ethiopians defended this violence in the name of patriotism. But my patriotism, my political loyalty, and my allegiance lie exclusively and firmly with Ethiopian women. And I thank you for inviting one of them to speak to you today.
I thank Ms. Berhanu again for a very powerful testimony and statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of the United Kingdom. May I begin by thanking you, Special Representative Pramila Patten, in the relationship and the strength of the relationship between the United Kingdom and your office is something we hold very dear, and we welcome the continued coordination and strength of the work we're doing on this important agenda. To our brave activists, Mariana Kerkutli and Helena Berhanu, for your stark insights and also for your practical recommendations of the responsibilities and also the importance of action from us, the United Nations Security Council. And of course, to you, Nadia Murad, your determination, your courage, your example has at its heart a real willpower to build a world for survivors. Simply put, it's an inspiration for me, and I know I speak for every member of the Security Council. And your testimony today is again reflective of that central objective that we all share. Yet today, as we've heard again from the very powerful testimonies and the report of SRSG Patten, we continue to see disturbing reports. Disturbing reports emerging yet again of rape and sexual violence from Ukraine. And we are now once again reminded that when conflict erupts, sexual violence soon follows. As we've heard in northern Ethiopia, Syria, and Ukraine, we have witnessed the devastating effects on communities, on families, and especially on women and girls. It is important we come together and stand for these courageous survivors, not just to provide hope, but to provide action and ultimately justice. It is clear that impunity continues to be the norm for perpetrators. It should be an exception, and we must strive for that. And frankly put, the fact here we are that this is happening, and let us reflect on that, in the year 2022 is not just unacceptable, it is utterly shocking. And therefore we must strive to do more collectively to end the violence and ultimately, as we heard from each of the very powerful statements, deliver justice and accountability for survivors. We need to ensure that survivors can safely record their experiences in a way that strengthens the pursuit of justice. That is an important first, yet pivotal and crucial step towards accountability. However, as we've heard from Nadia Murad's powerful testimony, this is far from a reality for many survivors around the world. And frankly put, we must ask the question of ourselves, why? Why have we failed to protect? Why have we failed in our collective duty to put survivors first? Despite numerous guidance for those collecting information and evidence from survivors and witnesses, mistakes, frankly, continue to be made. Mistakes not through any bad intent, yet mistakes which can allow the wheels of justice to slow and indeed destroy lives. Too many survivors are not told about what their options are or given the time and space to make their own choices about how their testimonies are best used. Too many survivors continue to face unnecessary re-interviewing. 27 times. Reflect on that figure, colleagues. 27 times, as one courageous survivor told me, they had to give an interview. Interviews are being interrupted. They're being overheard. And by that, the impact of those testimonies is diluted. And they do not meet the threshold which too often is put forward as the reason why prosecutions cannot take place. The consequences can be devastating, soul-destroying, ending all hope. Simply put, it is unacceptable. Survivors are being re-traumatized time and time again, and work to deliver justice and accountability is being undermined. So therefore, it is vital that we end these harmful practices and put survivors' rights at the very heart of the evidence gathering. And therefore, I'm greatly humbled, as we heard from Nadia Murad, to join Nadia's initiative and the Institute for the International Criminal Investigations in releasing the Murad Code today. Firstly, I turn to you, Nadia. Thank you. You and I have known each other many years. You inspire me, and your courage is a powerful example to us all, as we've heard again today. And the Murad Code, the code to which you have so kindly lent your name, is a code of conduct. It is a code of conduct for the collection of information and evidence from survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. Importantly, as we've heard from all the contributions, as we've heard from SRSG Pattern, it has been shaped by survivors. Survivors must be at the heart of the solutions we seek. But also, it's importantly brought together government, international organizations, and civil society. Because it is our collective responsibility to place survivors' needs at the very heart of our work. Therefore, I urge everyone involved in documenting and investigating conflict-related sexual violence, follow the Murad Code. In fact, go further, I would say. To my mind, it should become the very gold standard for any NGO, for any government agency, human rights institution, civil society group working in the field. Putting survivors first and at the center of investigations should not be an option. It should be done by everyone, everywhere. But our collective efforts cannot stop there. This year, we're exploring all options to strengthen international action, including an international convention as proposed by our Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss. And today, I'm also pleased to announce that from the 28th to the 30th of November, we will also host an international conference on this very issue, on preventing sexual violence in conflict, marking 10 years since we launched that very initiative. We will also, importantly, continue to bring faith and belief leaders together in support of survivors through the Declaration of Humanity. It cannot be right. Groups such as Daesh and others who use the veil of religion erroneously and perversely to somehow justify their abhorrent crimes and actions. Faith leaders are and continue to stand up to say very clearly, not in the name of our religion and not in the name of any faith or belief across the world. We will also make further progress to enhance the rights and well-being of children born of sexual violence and rape. I was honored to announce a call to action last November, but let's put that into perspective. A child born of such a crime, they should be given compassion. Instead, they are stigmatized. They are given rejection. That has to change at all levels. And we will also respond more robustly to reports of sexual violence in conflict, wherever, whenever they occur. We've just heard from Helena just now about the distressing situation in Ethiopia, the nature and scale of reports of sexual violence that have come out of Tigray, Amhara, and Afar are deeply, deeply disturbing. Yet many communities, as we've heard from that very testimony, remain cut off from communications and therefore unable to tell their story, seek the hope and indeed the support they need. And that is why it was important to us today, the United Kingdom, and I thank our ambassador and her team in this regard, to invite the first Ethiopian civil society representative to brief this Security Council on the situation in northern Ethiopia. And what's more, to hear directly from you, Helena, an Ethiopian woman who has been integral to feminist youth movements and who has recently worked with communities across the country who have been affected by conflict-related sexual violence. The United Kingdom government has committed more than £7 million to support survivors in northern Ethiopia and improve national accountability systems. And we will also continue to work to provide expertise, to build capacity, to hold perpetrators to account. And I welcome in this respect, the gauntlet was thrown down, but from our colleagues from the African Union, I pay tribute to the African Union's leadership on conflict-related sexual violence. 30 African countries now have a national action plan on women, peace and security, providing the very essential framework for addressing this issue and women's political participation in conflict-affected contexts. It's essential. Mariana, again, made that point. We have, within the UN framework, SRSG Patton and I discussed this, we have within the UN family incredible mediation networks of women. We need to ensure that expertise, those insights, are deployed directly, not just in resolving conflicts, but in actually building sustainable peace. Sadly, again, we've heard from Mariana of how rape is being used and continues to be used to destroy the lives of many Syrian women and girls by various parties to the conflict. And the United Kingdom continues to support and provide support in that area. £4 million through its Conflict Stability and Security Fund has been used in response to that crisis. We've also strengthened the medical documentation of attacks in accordance with international standards and improved support services for survivors. And I am absolutely convinced that the Murad Code will be an important contribution to enhance that collection of evidence. I was also pleased to see the first conviction for conflict-related sexual violence in Syria delivered in Koblenz in January. Let me assure you, as we look around the world, the United Kingdom will also continue to support Afghan women who face some of the highest rates of violence in the world and are watching the progress made in recent decades unravel in front of their eyes. And let us also send a very clear message to those who seek to suppress women's rights, who seek to suppress the rights of education for girls. And yes, that is a message clearly for the Taliban to hear. Islam as a religion based itself on equality for girls and rights for women. Islam is clear. Are you? Empower girls, educate girls, empower women. The evidence is in front of you. Societies prosper, nations progress. We are also pushing to integrate services for all survivors of gender-based violence, including sexual violence, into Afghan healthcare provision. And that's being informed directly by the people who know best. Many leaders, Afghan women leaders, who are helping us on this important agenda. We are also working with the International Rescue Committee, the UN Population Fund, and others on programs to protect women and girls and provide access to gender-based violence services. Colleagues, members of the Security Council, we are collectively shocked at the abhorrent testimonies we hear in every conflict. But today, as we sit here, the abhorrent testimonies which are emerging from Ukraine. The reports of rape and sexual violence committed by Russian armed forces must be properly investigated. And that is why the United Kingdom has worked with partners to refer the situation in Ukraine to the International Criminal Court, to establish a commission of inquiry through the UN Human Rights Council, and with the support directly of Ukraine, to establish an OSCE mission of experts. In March, we announced an additional £1 million in funding for the ICC to help uncover evidence of war crimes. And let me put it simply and starkly. Sexual violence, rape, it's a vile, vile stain on humanity. Wherever it occurs, whoever the perpetrators, it is our collective moral duty. Indeed, it is our absolute obligation to work together, to help survivors, and do all we can to stamp it out. And as Nadia said, we must work together to provide the routes and avenues to see justice for survivors. To perpetrators, we must send a very clear message. A clear message not just from the Security Council, but every person in every society must be determined to send that same unequivocal message in all its clarity. You will be found. You will face justice. You will be held to account. And finally, to the survivors, to those who are here and the courageous survivors around the world, thank you. Thank you for the hope that you provide in the face of such challenge, in the face of unimaginable consequences you have faced. Thank you for your courage and conviction to carry on. Sexual violence is not just a crime against you, it's a crime against our common and shared humanity. We stand for you, and we will always stand with you. Thank you. I now resume my function as President of the Council, and I give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Linda Thomas-Greenfield, Permanent Representative of the United States and member of President Biden's Cabinet. Your Excellency.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you so much for convening this very important discussion today. I also want to thank Special Representative Patton for your remarks. The United States is proud to support the important work of the SRSG's office. And most of all, thank you to the three briefers. Thank you for sharing your powerful stories. Your courage and your strength is an inspiration to all of us. As we all know, sexual violence is a horrific and deliberate tactic in conflict. It is used to terrorize, to destabilize, to break communities and people down. Its impact ripple out far beyond survivors, and it fuels instability. Unfortunately, this unspeakable practice is not new. I was recalling as you all spoke in the early 90s, attending meetings with Somali women who were victims of violence in Somalia and hearing their horrific stories of rape and their plea to all of us to support them. And here we are today, hearing those same pleas from all of you. The same acts of violence are still being committed around the world today. And women like those Somali women that I spoke to in the 1990s are sitting here listening at us today. On Monday, we outlined the threats to women and girls in Ukraine from Russia's brutal and unprovoked war. And we cannot forget or look away from the way rape and sexual violence have been used as a weapon of war in Ethiopia and Syria and other conflicts around the world. This council has spent a great deal of time discussing these issues, noting them with great concern. Well, now it's time for us to act. As we heard today, expressions of concern are not enough. First, we and all governments need to hold perpetrators accountable. We must do more as a global community to actually implement the international commitments we've all agreed to, as Ms. Patton said to us today. Governments, instead of denying these acts, must acknowledge them and they must address them. They have to stop intimidating victims, silencing their voices, solacing those who raise concern and advocate for them, and hold those responsible accountable. We must explore ways to use the diplomatic tools we have as both individual member states and as a collective to do everything we can to ensure perpetrators do not get away with these acts of conflict-related sexual violence. And that means strengthening quality, ethical, and effective documentation efforts. We caution against any action that would duplicate or dilute the efficacy of our existing Security Council mandates and legal frameworks. We have the tools we need. We just need to use them. We cannot let ourselves get distracted from the urgency of accountability, especially in those settings where we continue to receive reports of conflict-related sexual violence. After all, holding perpetrators accountable is not only the right thing to do, it deters others from enacting this violence in the future. It strengthens the rule of law. It makes reconciliation more likely, and it makes inclusive and democratic transition possible. Second, we must defend and empower survivors through a survivor-centered approach. That means listening to survivors, responding to their unique needs, and providing the resources and legal support they ask for and that they need. We have learned just how important it is to create a supportive environment to avoid re-traumatizing those who have experienced conflict-related sexual violence and to ensure that they are treated with dignity and respect. When we provide survivors with the resources they need to heal and to recover, we help them tremendously, and we help break the silence and the stigma surrounding sexual violence and conflict as well. Centering our support around survivors while securing justice for them is the clearest and the most powerful way to empower survivors to become agents of peace and voices of change, as we see from our colleague Nadia across this room. And again, Nadia, thank you so much for bringing your voice to us today. Third and finally, because all gender-based violence is rooted in gender inequality, we must advance the empowerment of women and girls in all of their diversity. To that end, the United Nations and all member states should apply conflict-sensitive and participatory gender analysis to our interventions and to our work. We need to ensure we are addressing the underlying societal norms and power relations that, when combined with weak or absent state institutions, lead to gender-based violence. We need to advance gender-sensitive early warning and response, and we must persevere in our promotion of the meaningful participation of women in decision-making roles, especially in conflict prevention, resolution, and peacekeeping processes. When we integrate women and girls into atrocity prevention efforts, we do more to prevent those atrocities. It is that simple. In the long term, the best defense against conflict-related sexual violence is an equal and just society, one where all women and girls have respect for their human rights, and where we enjoy equal protection under the law, where we have timely access to justice, and where we have the educational opportunities we all deserve. As the late Secretary Albright used to say, democracy is a parent to peace, and common sense tells us that true democracy is not possible without the full participation of women. So let us make democracy possible. Let us build those just and inclusive societies. And in the meantime, let us hold perpetrators accountable, take a survivor-centered approach, and integrate gender equity in everything we do. And as Nadia said, survivors don't want our pity. They want justice. They all have made, all of the women who spoke today, they all have made recommendations to us today. Let's pay homage to them and follow their lead. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Her Excellency Ambassador Ms. Thomas Greenfield for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Norway. Madam Ambassador.
Thank you, President, and thanks to Special Representative of the Secretary General, Pramila Patten, and to the civil society briefers for your very valuable statements. Time and time again, we hear in this chamber how sexual violence is being used as a tactic of war. And every year, these reports put into stark relief how we continue to fall short in effectively addressing both the immediate effects and the root causes of conflict-related violence, a grave violation of international law. This is completely abhorrent. I therefore wish to thank the UK for focusing this year's open debate on accountability as prevention. And I want to thank especially Nadia, Marina, and Helena for your very powerful interventions and for sharing your recommendations. Your testimonies remind us how participation and protection are inextricably linked. We see in Syria, as Mariana so strongly have testified, conflict-related violence in detention settings, the heightened risk of sexualized violence against displaced women, and negative coping mechanisms such as child labor and early and forced marriages. These are of particular concern. In Ethiopia, we are horrified by the numerous reports of, and from what we heard from Helena, systematic rape and gender-based violence. And we welcome the Commission of Experts established by the Human Rights Council to investigate allegations of human rights violation and abuses by all parties. This is essential for accountability, prevention, and reconciliation. And in Ukraine, we are deeply shocked by the atrocities committed against civilians in places that have been held by Russian forces, as well as the disturbing reports of conflict-related sexual violence. Ukrainian women and girls are placed further at risk by targeted Russian attacks against civilian infrastructure, forcing displacement and family separation, and depriving victims and survivors from access to essential health services. President, in this Council, we are still discussing what a comprehensive human rights-based and survivor-centered approach means. To make the move to actual implementation, we must recognize the root causes of CRSV and dare to suggest concrete measures. In this spirit, I will put forward 3 areas that Norway firmly believes will promote accountability and prevention. If sufficiently scaled up, addressed jointly and through multi-stakeholder coordination. First, we must build the capacity of law enforcement, security, and military sector personnel in both UN peace operations and national institutions. This helps reinforce accountability structures, tackles underlying structural inequalities and attitudes, and ensures that policies and action plans are actually put to use. A good example is how the UNMISS SGBV Specialized Police Team is supporting South Sudan's National Police Service. Second, we must invest in access to coordinated health care and services, legal services, and information. A commendable example is UNFPA's One-Stop Center, which are established in cooperation with local authorities, like in Mosul, Iraq. Third, placing the need of survivors at the center of our effort means also promoting and supporting their agencies. They themselves must be allowed to define and design what they think are necessary measures for prevention, protection, and accountability. As USG Patton has highlighted, reparations are what survivors of SRSV request most and yet still receive least. Let me also congratulate you, Nadia, and the UK on tomorrow's launch of the MORAD Code, an important initiative to place survivors' rights at the center of investigations and documentation of CRSV. President, financing and resources go hand in hand with monitoring and implementation of all 3 of these recommendations. As has been highlighted by the USG's office and echoed by UN Women, UNFPA, and civil society, the scale of the resources is far from equal to the scale of actions needed on the ground. Council members and the broader UN membership must join forces to ensure that the UN and CSOs have the necessary expertise, financing, and access in place. President, a final point. We all recognize that the elephant in the room is the lack of political will. By sending a strong collective signal through all Council's decisions and in our dialogue with conflict parties, we must remind them of their obligation and influence their actions. And we must insist on women's full, equal, and meaningful participation and protection from violence, not merely as an end in itself, but as a prerequisite for peace and stability. I hope this Council will send a strong signal today, clearly condemning any and all use of conflict-related sexual violence. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Norway. Thank you, Madam Ambassador. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates, Your Excellency.
Mr. President, Lord Ahmed, I would like to begin by thanking you and welcoming you for chairing this important open debate. We are delighted that the UK has joined the Shared Women, Peace and Security Presidency Commitment, and we welcome the growing number of signatories. I would like also to thank Special Representative Pamela Patton for her detailed briefing and the critical work of her office. I also want to thank Ms. Murad for her insightful briefing. The UAE has always admired Ms. Murad's courageous work, and we are proud to support Nadia's initiative, her non-profit empowering the brave Yazidi women of Iraq. I listened also carefully to the briefings by Ms. Karkutli and Ms. Berhano. Mr. President, sexual and gender-based violence is a despicable scourge, and this Council must do more to prevent it in conflict situations. When such violence is used as a tool of war, it exacerbates conflict and sets back progress towards inclusive, equal, and stable societies. As the rate of conflict and instability around the world increases, so too have the disturbing reports on the situation of women and girls in these settings. Women and girls in Afghanistan continue to be subjected to sexual slavery and rape. In Syria and Iraq, the heinous acts of Daesh continue to have an impact. At the Ukrainian border, women and girls are targeted by human and sex traffickers as they flee the conflict. And as we also heard today, the tragic experiences of women and girls face in many other conflicts. The United Arab Emirates, therefore, welcomes the focus on the structural prevention, resilience building, and accountability in the Secretary General's report this year. As members of the international community, the Security Council and the wider UN membership have a responsibility to prioritize prevention, ensure accountability, and end this horror. In this regard, we would like to make the following recommendations. First, the most effective response to sexual and gender-based violence is preventing it from happening in the first place. As this Special Representative has pointed out time and again, effective prevention strategies require addressing root causes, most notably structural gender inequality and harmful social norms. This includes strengthening women's and girls' resilience by ensuring they enjoy equal access to public life, education, and economic participation. Recognizing and understanding their role as active agents of change and dynamic members of society is thus the first step in prevention. Second, accountability needs to be pursued by upholding and strengthening the rule of law. There is a transformative period following conflict and crisis to strengthen the capacity of relevant national institutions, such as law enforcement and the security sector, so that they may better uphold the rule of law. Capacity building, if coupled with the deployment of gender and protection expertise that focuses on a survivor-centered approach, can be a critical tool to establish a system that promotes accountability. Third, the international community must hold non-state armed groups accountable for conflict-related sexual violence, not least because they are increasingly central actors in conflict settings. Grave violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law require accountability. A strong tool for the Security Council to achieve this is to include conflict-related sexual violence as a standalone designation criterion for sanctions and to list individuals and entities whenever they are responsible for the commission of such acts. In this regard, we welcome the recent decision made by the Council to designate the Houthis as an entity, including for perpetrating a policy of sexual violence in conflict. Efforts like these contribute to the prevention of and response to these crimes on the ground, and Council members must remain consistent in their approach. In conclusion, there is no justification for the fact that conflict-related sexual violence remains a reality. The Council, the UN, its member states, the private sector, and civil society must work together and make it a priority to eliminate these crimes once and for all. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates. I now give the floor to the representative of India. Mr. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, we thank the United Kingdom for convening the open debate on this important issue. We also thank SRSG Pramila Patten and all other distinguished briefers for sharing their insights. In the last 3 decades, the international community has played an important role in fixing accountability for conflict-related sexual violence, thereby sending out a strong message that sexual violence has no place in the civilized world. The prosecutions of conflict-related sexual crimes by the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and for Rwanda, UN Security Council resolutions on sexual violence, and United Kingdom's Preventing Sexual Violence and Conflict Initiative have contributed to addressing this complex and sensitive issue in its entirety. Despite this progress, it is indeed distressing that sexual violence in conflict situations continue unabated amidst a culture of impunity as a tactic of war, torture, and terror in armed conflicts, especially by non-state actors. Again, despite the robust framework put in place by the Security Council since 2007, with the launching of the UN Action Against Sexual Violence in Conflict, the levels of compliance by parties to the conflict remains low. Majority of the parties listed in the Secretary General's annual report on conflict-related sexual violence are persistent perpetrators who continue to commit or abet sexual violence in armed situations. This must stop. The Council must focus on identifying and bridging the implementation gaps to prevent the atrocities and facilitate the rehabilitation and reintegration of survivors. Mr. President, my delegation wishes to highlight the following 6 issues for the consideration of the Council. First, national governments have the primary responsibility for prosecuting and deterring such crimes in conflict situations on their territories, even if these are alleged to have been committed by non-state actors. Member states should ensure effective prosecution of sexual violence as a self-standing crime. Second, upon request, the UN must assist national authorities in developing capabilities to strengthen their national legal frameworks and related structures for speedy investigation and prosecution of perpetrators. This should also be a priority in post-conflict situations to address holistically the structural and cross-cutting gender inequalities that perpetuate sexual violence. Third, the member states must adopt a victim-centered approach to preventing and responding to sexual violence in armed conflicts in line with Resolution 2467 that seeks to strengthen justice and accountability and calls for a survivor-centered approach in the prevention and response to conflict-related sexual violence. States must ensure adequate focus and resources for comprehensive and non-discriminatory assistance for victims of sexual violence by providing for medical, psychological, social, and legal services. A key starting point in strengthening the accountability process is by addressing the endemic stigma attached to survivors of sexual violence and fear of reprisals by offenders, thereby helping them to come forward to speak to investigators and testify in court. Fourth, terrorism and violent extremism conducive to terrorism continue to be the biggest global threat to peace and security, with women suffering disproportionately in the resulting conflicts engendered by them. Sexual violence, primarily directed against women and girls and increasingly among men and boys by terrorists, remains a cause of concern. The nexus between terrorism, trafficking, and sexual violence in armed conflict needs to be broken. Fifth, the sanctions regimes and other targeted measures by the Council need to be strengthened to utilize their full potential to deter perpetrators of sexual violence in armed conflict. Last but not the least, the member states must provide a conducive environment for the participation and inclusion of women in political processes and decision-making. India has moved ahead from women's development to women-led development. We have been advocating this idea for lasting peace in our neighborhood, including in Afghanistan, in line with the UN Security Council Resolution 2593, especially relating to women, children, and minorities. Mr. President, in 2017, Prime Minister Modi joined the Circle of Leadership that was formally established by the Secretary General at the high-level meeting on the prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse in the United Nations operations. India has also signed the Secretary General's Voluntary Compact against sexual exploitation and abuse. India has the distinction of sending the first all-women formed police unit contingent to Liberia in 2007. This unit mitigated incidents of crime against women, deterred sexual and gender-based violence, and helped rebuild safety and confidence among the Liberian population. In this process, it also operationalized the spirit of the landmark Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security into action. These courageous Indian women patrolled Monrovian streets at night, taught Liberian women self-defense skills, and conducted classes on combating sexual the number of women peacekeepers. We also support increasing the deployment of women protection advisors for effective monitoring, analysis, and reporting arrangements on conflict-related sexual violence in the field. To conclude, India reaffirms its commitment to actively contribute to a collective endeavor in effectively tackling sexual violence in situations of armed conflict. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of India. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I now give the floor to the representative of Brazil, Your Excellency.
Many thanks, Mr. President. It is highly regrettable to be here today calling once more for an end to an utterly unacceptable crime committed most against women and girls, but also against men and boys. Sexual violence in conflict destroys the social fabric of communities and inflicts long-lasting psychological trauma, having a direct bearing on the resilience of peace and on the prospects for sustainable development. Perpetrators, be they state or non-state actors, terrorists or mercenaries, should now be thinking twice before they commit such crimes. But they do not stop. They continue because they know that most probably their actions will go unpunished, even though they are committing well-known violations of international human rights and international humanitarian law, abhorrent acts prohibited both in times of war and peace. Today's briefings and the latest report of the Secretary General serve as stark reminders that the fight to end sexual violence as a weapon of war, as a tool of intimidation and social control in conflict and post-conflict situations is very far from over. Mr. President, Lord Ahmad, Brazil thanks the United Kingdom for organizing today's debate and the briefers for their comprehensive presentations. In addition to that, we take this opportunity to commend Special Representative Pramila Patten for her work and her office for the crucial role they play in international efforts to combat sexual violence in conflict. We also thank Ms. Nadia Murad, Mariana Karkutli, and Helena Berjano for their testimonials. They show us the strength of the committed work of victims themselves and of their organizations on the ground. Addressing the prevailing culture of impunity for the crime of sexual violence in conflict is paramount, not just as a means of reparation, but also of delivering justice by making perpetrators accountable for their crimes. It is also, as experience shows, an important tool to prevent the horrific scenarios described by the aforementioned reports and a myriad of other accounts. As Ms. Simmers-Bauhaus told us on Monday, and Ms. Pramila confirmed today, red signs are now flying all over as allegations of sexual violence are reported in the context of the conflict in Ukraine. Brazil reiterates its calls for urgent independent investigations of such allegations and welcomes the participation of UN women experts, skilled and experienced, to investigate sexual violence, abuse, and exploitation in the works of the Commission of Inquiry of the Human Rights Council. This council should respond appropriately to all allegations of sexual violence in conflicts under its agenda. This response must recognize the problem and strengthen, whenever appropriate, the mandates of peacekeeping operations and special political missions as to promote real changes on the ground. Recent reports in South Sudan offer a horrific account of sexual violence being used as a weapon of war and remind us of the grave consequences of widespread impunity for sexual violence in conflict. The recent approved Resolution 2625 on South Sudan, which renews the mandate of UNMISS, expresses serious concerns at those ongoing reports and underlines the urgency of timely investigations, not only to support accountability, but also to provide assistance and protection to survivors. It enables UNMISS to curb sexual violence within its core directive for the protection of civilians. In fact, UNMISS may use a variety of means and areas of deployment to deter, prevent, and respond to sexual and gender-based violence, including by facilitating access to organizations that provide services and support to survivors. But having such provisions in the Council's resolutions is not enough. This Council must urgently address the funding shortfalls that prevent it from delivering a satisfactory response. And that includes having the resources, for instance, to continue to deploy women's protection advisors to bring behavioral change through engagement with the parties to the conflict. It is also essential to guarantee that pre-deployment training of UN troops and personnel includes capacity building to recognize and respond to sexual violence in conflict, including on early warning and risk mitigation. Troops should be trained to help foster an enabling environment for surviving victims to seek support and for perpetrators to be persecuted for their crimes. Peace agreements and post-conflict arrangements hardly ever deal with the situation of those who have been subjected to violence during conflict and its aftermath. With the support of the Peacebuilding Commission, this Council should continue to advocate for the inclusion of references in peace agreements, consider the imperative to, ideally at least, eradicate all forms of sexual violence, especially against all women and girls, and of provisions related to accountability for gender-based violence. Promoting full, equal, and meaningful participation of women in decision-making processes and peace talks also means tackling the root causes of sexual violence in conflict, including structural gender inequality and harmful social norms that lead to the stigmatization and discrimination of survivors. Any and every step towards the implementation of women and peace and security resolutions is very much welcome. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Brazil. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Mr. President, I welcome your chairing of today's meeting, and I thank CRSV Pattern and the representatives of civil society for their briefings. According to the SG's report, sexual violence continues to be used as a tactic of war and terrorism, causing profound sufferings to vulnerable groups such as women and girls. China strongly condemns all sexual violence against women and girls and calls on the international community to take comprehensive measures to tackle this problem. In this connection, I would like to make the following observations. First, building a solid foundation for peace by stepping up conflict prevention and political settlement. As the most vulnerable groups in conflicts and turmoil, women and girls are the main victims of sexual violence. The most fundamental protection of them is the prevention and resolution of conflicts so as to eliminate the breeding ground for sexual violence. The Security Council should make good use of the toolkit entrusted by the UN Charter, increase investment in political settlement of hotspot issues, and make more efforts in peaceful means such as negotiation, good offices, and mediation. The UN political and peacekeeping missions should also, based on their mandates, play their due roles in early warning of conflicts and protection of vulnerable groups. Second, combating terrorism so as to eliminate violence against women by terrorist and extremist forces. In recent years, terrorist groups, kidnapping, and human trafficking, as well as sexual violence and exploitation, have become increasingly rampant. Many alleged perpetrators of sexual violence in the SG's report are actually terrorist groups listed by the 1267 Committee of the Security Council. The international community should closely integrate the elimination of sexual violence in conflicts with the fight against terrorism by adhering to unified standards and jointly combating all terrorist and extremist forces so as to end violence against women and girls. Third, amplifying the she power and actively supporting women's development and empowerment. Sexual violence in conflict is closely related to the root causes and deep-seated imbalances such as gender inequality and underdevelopment. The international community should tackle the issue of conflict-related sexual violence in an integrated manner within the overall framework of women's empowerment and development, striving to eliminate gender discrimination and differential treatment, removing the development gap faced by women, and promoting synergy between women's endeavor and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. It is essential to continue to amplify women's active position, participation, and transformative power in the field of peace and security, and actively support women's effective participation in peace processes, peacekeeping, and peace building. Fourth, upholding the leadership of countries concerned and supporting their efforts in pursuing accountability. The countries concerned have the primary responsibility for preventing and combating sexual violence in conflicts and protecting women and children of their countries. Based on respecting the judicial sovereignty and the leadership of the countries concerned, the international community should provide targeted assistance in rule of law, security, and humanitarian fields. Assist the countries concerned in providing timely protection and assistance to victims of sexual violence in conflicts, and step up capacity building of judicial organs so as to bring perpetrators to justice and bring justice to victims. Mr. President, Ms. Nadia Murad is a survivor of sexual violence by the Islamic State terrorist group. Her tragic experience is heartbreaking, while her tenacity and courage awe-inspiring. For over 7 years, she has been advocating for Yazidi survivors like her. All she asked for were 2 words: accountability and justice. In East Asia, there is also a group of victims of sexual violence in conflict who have been living with nightmare memories but have not been able to get justice even till their death. This group is the comfort woman forcibly drafted by the Japanese army during the Second World War. During that period, hundreds of thousands of women and girls from China, the Korean Peninsula, Southeast Asia, and other countries and regions were forcibly conscripted by Japanese militarism as comfort women and became prisoner in hell. They have experienced horrific sexual violence, both mentally and physically. However, to our indignation, for decades, some forces in Japan have stubbornly adhered to misconceptions and kept attempting to deny and whitewash the history of aggression. As recent as last month, some of the textbooks approved by the Japanese government once again blurred historical facts through word games, attempting to downplay and evade the historical guilt of forced recruitment of comfort women. We solemnly urge Japan to face up to and reflect on the history of aggression, handle issues left over from history, such as the forced drafting of comfort women in a responsible manner, bring justice to the victims and survivors, and being accountable to the people of the invaded countries so as not to further lose trust from its Asian neighbors and the international community. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China, and I now give the floor to the representative of Albania. Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you for organizing this open debate on this crucial issue. And the number of speakers, by itself speaks of the paramount importance that the UN member states accord to this issue. We were moved by the powerful message from Ms. Murad, and we thank her, as well as Ms. Karkutli and Ms. Berhanu. And again, thank you, Mr. President and UK team, for bringing these important voices in our discussion, a testimony of how much we need to hear the civil society in the Council. Mr. President, we all know where we come from on this issue. For a very long time, conflict-related sexual violence crimes have not been recognized as crimes against humanity and war crimes, and as such were only rarely prosecuted, or not at all. Thankfully, this has changed in the course of the last 3 decades, but on the lower side, atrocities and conflict-related violence based on sexual orientation continues to persist in many parts of the world. Sexual violence continues to be used as a weapon of war and terror to punish civilians, terrorize communities, break up families for the sheer sick choice of perpetrators. Women are raped, men are tortured, girls are exploited and sold, children are born to rape mothers and end up being excluded by their communities. This is what has or is still happening in many war theaters from Tigray to Syria, from Myanmar, Afghanistan to Yemen, but not only, and the list is much longer. There is unfortunately a new situation where, as the days go by, we see new gruesome pictures getting out of the darkness of the war in Ukraine, and we hear new chilling testimonies of women and girls raped by the Russian aggressors. Only 2 days ago, the executive director of UN Women, speaking on the situation of Ukraine, said in this chamber, and I quote, that they were increasingly hearing of rape and sexual violence. It was a stark warning of what is to come. In a remarkably well-documented investigation, an example of excellence of the kind, the New York Times tells a part of a story of Bucha, this landscape of horror. The evidence uncovered shows that Russian soldiers not only killed recklessly and sadically in revenge for their defeat. There is more. There is this woman held as a sex slave in a cellar before being cold-bloodily executed. Ukraine's ombudswoman speaks about horrific cases of sexual violence of a group of women and girls kept in a basement of a house for 25 days, and 9 of them are unwillingly pregnant now. By committing such despicable crimes and systematically denying them, as we hear, perpetrators kill twice. This is the only so-called nobility of this war. We know the lie is the backbone of every dictatorship, and Russia has made it its flagship communication tactic. These crimes must not be left unanswered. Perpetrators are being identified, and they must be prosecuted and convicted. Mr. President, all parties to conflict, whether they are state or non-state actors, are bound by international law. While in the past sexual violence has often been seen as a byproduct of war, it is now recognized as a war crime and a core security challenge. It is outlawed by many international legal frameworks and Security Council resolutions. So, and here I echo SRSG Patton's question, why it is still so widespread in conflicts from Ukraine to Myanmar, from Afghanistan to South Sudan? Why some state actors still do condone sexual violence as a means of warfare? The unacceptable and deploring reality is that despite collective efforts, conflict-related sexual violence goes largely unpunished. We have the law, but there is a lack of proper implementation. We express outrage, but we end up with little action, and this is what must end. Mr. President, coming from a region which in the not-so-distant past has been the stage of major conflicts and human suffering, we have witnessed how sexual violence was used as a tactic of war against civilians. Sexual violence was a despicable weapon of war, an instrument to humiliate, widely used in the conflict in Kosovo in 1989-99. This horrible crime has left a profound imprint on survivors and in society alike. While the conflict-related sexual crimes committed in Kosovo have regrettably never been included in the Secretary General's report on sexual violence and its annexes, we commend UN Women for its work in assisting and training the Kosovo authorities to investigate, prosecute, and adjudicate cases of conflict-related sexual violence and address their legacy by integrating a survivor-centered, human rights-based approach. Because the voices of more than 20,000 abused women and girls during the conflict in Kosovo must be heard. Just like all voices of all survivors of sexual violence anywhere in the world must be heard. In this respect, we commend SRSG Patent for the publication of the anthology In Their Words, Voices of Survivors of Conflict-Related Sexual Violence, which contains 150 powerful and heartbreaking stories of the survivors. Reading their words, one understands the destructive force and the dehumanizing nature of this horrendous crime. It doesn't just harm a single individual, or a single family, or even a single group. It negatively affects entire families and communities, erodes social and political stability, and undermines economic progress, as you, Lord Ahmad, rightly put it. Mr. President, if we want to finally end this universal scourge, we must be able to do more and better, and that is by taking action. First, we must prioritize prevention, and we can contribute by including the prevention and the response to conflict-related sexual violence when we design and renew mandates of peace operations, what we do here in the Council. The deployment of women's protection advisors has proven to be very effective in ensuring more timely, accurate, and reliable information regarding conflict-related sexual violence in the field. Second, and everybody agrees, we must improve and strengthen accountability. Ensuring accountability by putting an end to impunity for violations and abuses must be our priority. We strongly support the work of the UN team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence in conflict, as well as the model legislative provisions and guidance launched by the Office of the SRSG. Albania welcomes the steps taken by some countries and the universal jurisdiction in their national courts and encourage a more coordinated approach among states towards this end. We will be very pleased to follow the Murad Code for collective evidence, because only evidence leads to accountability, and accountability helps healing wounds. In the Council, we should incorporate sexual violence as a standalone designation criterion for targeted sanctions when we cannot do better than that. The message should be one and clear. No one that has promoted, used, or plans to use sexual violence as a tactic of war will escape justice. And finally, we must ensure effective and secure participation of civil society, as it was the case today, in particular women's organizations, in efforts to address conflict-related sexual violence at all stages, including reparation and rehabilitation. And we must protect women activists, including women human rights defenders, journalists and peace builders, and those working directly on conflict-related violence from any reprisal. I will end, Mr. President, with this. Spending time to only condemn such crimes is not an option. We must take concrete actions in the entire chain of steps: prevent violence, protect individuals, punish perpetrators, and provide redress to victims and survivors. The legal framework is worth only if it is implemented. Otherwise, it is just printed paper. We must use the recent accounts of victims of sexual violence in Ukraine and anywhere else in the world as a most urgent wake-up call. No perpetrator should go unpunished, not in Ukraine, not in Yemen, not in Afghanistan, not in Syria, not in Kosovo, not anywhere. And I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I thank the representative of Albania. I now pass the floor to the representative of Ireland, Your Excellency.
Thank you, President, and thank you for convening today's debate, and in particular for bringing to the table such strong voices from civil society. Nadia, Mariana, and Helena, the work that you do to protect and advocate for survivors of sexual violence is invaluable. Thank you for your courage. Courage we here need to take heed of, as you said, Nadia. I also want to thank Special Representative Patton for your work and for the work of your team. Your tireless work in documenting these heinous crimes is critical. President, the Secretary-General's report is brutally clear. Conflict-related sexual violence is rampant. It is going unpunished, and it is destroying lives and communities. It continues to be wielded as an appalling and illegal weapon of war, torture, and terrorism. And with widespread impunity the norm, perpetrators are acting without fear of consequence. We are deeply concerned that sexual violence is increasingly being used to silence women, especially women human rights defenders and those who speak out politically. The horrific reports from Afghanistan and Myanmar are grave testament to this. The constraining of civil society space, coupled with misogynistic threats and violence, is not only unacceptable, but outright dangerous. Anywhere women cannot freely participate in public life, they are not only deprived of their rights, but society is prevented from reaching its full potential and achieving sustainable peace. President, we agree with the Secretary-General that adequate attention is not being paid to prevention. Time and again, we have failed to prevent the escalation of sexual violence and to protect survivors. The shocking examples documented from Ethiopia by the joint UN-Ethiopian Human Rights Commission report clearly tell us this. And as we have just heard from Helena, these are just a sample of the widespread and systematic use of sexual violence that has defined the conflict in Ethiopia. All parties to this conflict are accused of egregious acts of sexual violence. We are deeply concerned that this time next year we will be discussing similar testimonies arising from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where we have seen enough credible reports to believe that widespread sexual violence is already occurring. The roadmap to prevention is clear. There exists a robust framework, including resolutions by this Council, which outlaws conflict-related sexual violence and which can hold perpetrators to account, which prevents future violations and, importantly, ensures justice for survivors. The real gap is implementation. As the SRSG put it this morning, what do the resolutions of this Council mean to victims and survivors of conflict-related sexual violence? Parties to conflict must have at the forefront of their minds that sexual and gender-based violence can amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. Perpetrators must be held accountable. Domestic, regional, and international courts all play an essential role in this. For instance, the Bemba and Ongwen convictions by the International Criminal Court demonstrated that sexual violence will no longer be treated as a collateral crime. However, as the Secretary-General has highlighted, too few situations, including where widespread conflict-related sexual violence has been reported, have been referred to the ICC by this Council. In Syria, the IIIM and the Independent International Commission of Inquiry have played an instrumental role in bridging the accountability gap left by Council inaction. The gathering and preservation of evidence is fundamental for ensuring accountability and has enabled convictions for sexual violence crimes at the domestic level. We saw this recently in the watershed Koblenz proceedings in Germany, as others have referenced. We also need to ensure that we embed the prevention of conflict-related sexual violence in operational provisions of all mandates agreed by this Council. As recommended by the Informal Expert Group on Women, Peace and Security, we should integrate women's protection advisors into the budgets of UN peace operations, particularly during transition processes. The use of targeted sanctions on grounds of conflict-related sexual violence is another important but underutilised tool at this Council's disposal. Alongside our pursuit of justice, we need to prioritise a survivor-centred approach for all, including men and boys, as well as members of the LGBTI+ plus community. Access to gender and age-sensitive services, including sexual and reproductive health services and psychosocial support, is essential. President, many factors exacerbate conflict-related sexual violence. However, the fundamental root cause is inequality. Conflict-related sexual violence is the most horrific abuse of power. It is a shameful scourge that will only end when we do the right thing and embrace gender equality. President, this Council has made countless commitments to address conflict-related sexual violence. Now let's implement them. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ireland, and I now pass the floor to the representative of France for their statement. Your Excellency.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I wish to thank all speakers for their powerful testimony. I wish to recall our full support for the mandate of the Special Representative, Madam Pramila Patten. I wish to applaud the remarkable commitment of Madam Nadia Murad. Through Madam Murad, I wish to extend our gratitude for all of those taking action on the ground to counter the scourge of sexual violence. Given the situation in Ukraine, which continues to deteriorate, we were appalled to learn of allegations of rape and sexual violence. The mounting testimony is terrifying and needs to be subject to impartial, prompt, and independent investigation. Perpetrators of the crimes cannot be left unpunished. France emphatically, categorically condemns the use of sexual violence as a tactic or means of warfare, torture, or terror. I would particularly mention instances of sexual violence which were observed in Ethiopia, Syria, Yemen, as well as in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We condemn any and all sexist, misogynistic, and homophobic rhetoric which exacerbates this violence. To prevent sexual violence and to hold perpetrators accountable, France's action rests on three pillars. Firstly, we are committed to providing assistance to victims and survivors. In this regard, we commend your efforts, Madam Murad, as well as those of Dr. Mukwege. France takes pride in having contributed 6.2 million euros for the Global Survivors Fund, and we have a seat on the board. We support the establishment of pilot projects on the ground in Iraq, Central African Republic, South Sudan, among others. In Nigeria, a project is supporting the return to school and training for girls who are abducted by Boko Haram. These are various initiatives which are rooted in local partnerships to provide access to medical, physical, and psychological, as well as financial support and treatment. Despite some progress which has been achieved, we condemn the persistent culture of impunity. Moreover, we denounce reprisals endured by rights defenders. We are aware of the fact that the normative framework is robust. However, implementation, which is vital, is woefully lacking. 49 parties were listed in the annex to the Secretary General's report, and most have been listed for a number of years. French jurisdictions have been acting. Alongside Sweden, France put together a team to investigate crimes perpetrated against the Yazidi population in Syria and Iraq. We recall our support for the vital role played by the ICC in this regard. In parallel with the fight against impunity, it is incumbent upon the Security Council to leverage all tools at its disposal, specifically sanctions, which are a deterrent tool which is insufficiently applied. Lastly, it is incumbent upon us to ensure that there is advocacy and to reinforce our commitments. This is the thrust of the launch of the Women, Peace, Security, and Humanitarian Action Compact during the Generation Equality Forum. At the national level, this is the objective of the adoption of the third action plan on women, peace, and security agenda. At the European level, this is the goal of the conference to be organized on the role of women in mediation. We call upon all states to renew and to fully uphold their commitments. Alongside the United Nations, we should enhance awareness about the obligations of parties and the rights of victims. This is also the thrust of our political and financial support for civil society, whose initiatives and advocacy are indispensable. Rest assured that the fight against sexual violence remain at the heart of our priorities at the Security Council. We will see to ensure the implementation of the Women, Peace, and Security resolution and to ensure that adequate resources are made available for teams on the ground. Thank you.
And I give the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Mr.
President, we thank the United Kingdom for having convened this timely and necessary debate. I also express gratitude for the briefings delivered by Special Representative Pramila Patten, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate Nadir Murad, as well as for the briefing given by Mariana Karkutli and that of Helena Barhanu. Their testimony prompts us to reflect, but compel us to make commitments and to act. The Secretary General's report depicts the complex scenarios which are overwhelmingly, frankly, devastating. Contexts and scenarios in which sexual violence in conflict continues to occur and goes unpunished. Sexual abuse and rape is used with unprecedented frequency as a weapon of war. Perpetrators are often repeat offenders and enjoy total impunity. At the same time, victims remain marginalized and are beset by absurd lines of questioning and cumbersome legal procedures in criminal justice systems which are not designed to help them or to hear them. As we heard in Syria, and that was the case in Syria and Yemen, as we heard. Of course, Mexico unequivocally condemns all of these war crimes and crimes against humanity and joins those who have spoken up to say enough is enough. The UN has to be, we have to be, more effective and demonstrate greater collective commitment to combating these unacceptable crimes. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, armed groups continue to use sexual violence as a tactic for the control of natural resources. In Ethiopia, practically all parties to the conflict have participated in acts of brutality. These include gang rapes and the intentional transmission of the HIV virus. In Afghanistan, Myanmar, and Sudan, sexual violence has been perpetrated against political activists who were peacefully demonstrating. Despite the normative framework that we have in place, impunity remains the norm, and survivors' access to justice the exception. There is no doubt the underlying causes of sexual violence in conflict cannot be understood in isolation from other factors, such as gender inequality or discrimination. But explaining these underlying causes is not sufficient to eradicate them. The informal expert group of Women, Peace and Security that Mexico co-chairs alongside Ireland held a meeting at the end of last year on sexual violence in conflict. And this was attended by women protection advisors deployed in various missions. That meeting produced specific recommendations that were practical in nature that we thought could be highly useful indeed. We will soon hold another meeting because we do need to ensure proper follow-up to our action. We need approaches which help us to find alternatives that are more pragmatic. that are more focused in nature. We need simpler procedures. We need to give credence to victim testimony. We need to think about forming specialised courts with duly trained personnel. We need to ensure ultimately that justice is expedited and not administered by drip feed. Mr. President, Mexico supports the recommendations presented by the Secretary General in his report. And by way of a supplement, we issue the following recommendations, which are very much in the same vein as the recommendations that we've heard about this morning from the briefers. 1. Strengthen accountability mechanisms with justice systems that have police personnel and expert witnesses working for them, all personnel properly qualified to investigate crimes with a gender focus. 2. Guaranteeing survivors of sexual violence access to justice with reliable mechanisms for the reporting of such crimes. There also need to be functional measures to provide damages and comprehensive redress processes in place. 3. Bring to international bodies, including, incidentally, the International Criminal Court, all those cases which national authorities are not able or willing to try or hear. 4. Adopt comprehensive survivor-focused measures which are designed with their participation and measures which are tailored to their priorities and needs, including ensuring access to sexual and reproductive health and rights services, as well as access to mental health services. 5. Meet quickly the needs of men and boys and the needs of persons from the LGBTI community and that themselves have been the victims of conflict-related sexual violence. 6. Recognize women leaders of civil society, women peace builders, and women human rights defenders as strategic allies in the prevention and tackling of sexual violence, guaranteeing their participation with the protection they require to do so. 7. Strengthen and increase the appointment of women protections advisors in peace operations and in resident coordinators' offices, as well as in humanitarian affairs offices of the United Nations. Mr. President, I conclude now. The prevention of sexual violence begins by guaranteeing the full, equal, and substantive participation of women in the public and political life of their communities. Without ensuring that occurs, it will be difficult for us to achieve just, inclusive societies and sustainable peace processes. And consequently, it is difficult to envisage putting an end to cycles of sexual violence in conflict, which we repeatedly consider in this Council. Thank you.
Representative of Mexico for their statement. And I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. We are grateful to the Secretary General and his Special Representative, Madam Patton, for the drafting of the report for the year 2021. We also wish to thank the briefers who have been invited. We believe that work to prevent and eradicate violence needs to be systemic, comprehensive, and account for the identified root causes of this scourge. The focus of efforts to counter manifestations of sexual violence need to result in long-standing and sustainable results. During armed conflicts, women and children are the most vulnerable categories of civilians. We believe that issues of preventing and combating sexual violence during all stages of armed conflict and in post-conflict situations is fully and chiefly within the purview of national governments. Measures adopted by UN bodies or civil society should need merely to supplement the efforts of states. We are troubled, Mr. President, by the information in the Secretary General's report about mounting violence against women and girls in conflict areas in Africa, Colombia, and Syria. Thousands of people contained in Syria, in the Al-Hol and Rukban camps, which are under U.S. occupant control, endure violence, exploitation, and brutal treatment. They are cast aside and marginalized and destitute. Prostitution, theft, sexual exploitation of minors, trafficking in persons are rife in the camps, and unequal marriages are being carried out there. Mr. President, today, yet again, we heard unsubstantiated, baseless accusations against Russian military personnel who are carrying out their duty under the special military operation in Ukraine. We emphatically reject these insulting and baseless insinuations. Here we see a part of the unprincipled information war which is has actively been unleashed at present against the Russian Federation by Ukraine and its Western patrons. The actions of Russian field units within and without combat conditions are subject to uniform, stringent rules for all personnel, irrespective of rank or title. One of the objectives of the campaign to tarnish Russian military personnel is the concealment of real instances of sexual violence by Ukrainian radicals who have been perpetrating this against the residents of Donbass since 2014. For years, the OHCHR monitoring mission in Ukraine and other international institutions have been publishing reports about numerous egregious instances of beatings, electric shock being applied to the genital area, threats of rape, and forcible nudity against men and women who were accused of collaboration with the authorities of Donetsk and Lugansk. The detainees were denied medical assistance, and they were subject to death threats and threats of a sexual nature. These threats targeted both themselves and their family members. Hence, it is hardly surprising that we have been witnessing an acute uptick in instances of sexual violence in territories under the control of the Ukrainian government. We believe that these crimes need to be emphatically condemned, perpetrators need to be stringently punished, and they should not be passed over in silence, contrary to what some in the West may wish. Today, the action of the Ukrainian nationalist battalions, Nazi battalions, and the territorial defense units are carbon copies of the tactics being used by ISIL terrorists. This includes civilians being used as human shields, the placement of weapons in homes, schools, hospitals, and other civilian infrastructure objects. And at the same time, the bacchanalia of murder and humiliation of Ukrainian residents who are suspected of disloyalty to the regime is skyrocketing. Here are but some examples. On 7 March, in the Komunar coal mine area in Donetsk, DPR military personnel arrived to clear the territory of mines, and they discovered a grave with the bodies of 4 women. Upon formal review, it was determined that before their deaths, they were tortured and raped. One of the victims was pregnant. This is the area where the Aidar Nazi unit was located. On 28 March, the Azov Battalion Nazis entered school number 18 in Mariupol, and they tortured a girl there to death. Her mutilated body, with hands cut off, with a swastika branded on her stomach, was a shock to all who saw this. We mentioned this tragedy during the 11 April meeting held in this chamber. On 21 March, nationalists abused Roma who were fleeing to West Ukraine. They were undressed, sprayed with green dye, tied to lampposts, and accused of theft. On 3 April, in the center of Pavlograd, in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, territorial defense representatives undressed and tied a local woman to a lamppost. Police officers witnessing the incident did not intervene. Yesterday, concerned Ukrainian citizens placed a video clip on the web where police officers publicly beat a woman tied to a lamppost with a rod, having first degraded her by stripping her of clothing. I'm talking about facts, facts which are accessible to all. I'm not talking about baseless insinuations. This heinous practice of public stripping, violence, and punishment is characteristic of medieval Europe, and now, unfortunately, it has become commonplace in Ukraine. The conflict in Ukraine has activated an industry of exploitation of Ukrainian refugees on the soil of European countries. Judging by existing information, key European Union agencies assess the threat of Ukrainian refugees being trafficked as very high, given the fact that in recent years, Ukraine was among the top 5 countries in terms of the number of human trafficking victims and sexual exploitation victims in European countries. And it would be naive to think that this situation would somehow change overnight. Mr. President, we call upon our colleagues not to keep silent about these alarming trends, not to keep silent about the evidence that I mentioned about these sexually based crimes perpetrated by Ukrainian soldiers. Thank you.
I note the statement from the representative of the Russian Federation, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by thanking the UK delegation for convening this open debate, which provides the Council with an opportunity to sustain its engagement on an issue of great importance to the global community. I also wish to express appreciation to Special Representative Pramila Patten and the other briefers for drawing our attention to specific conflict situations where sexual violence continues to be a concern and the need for action to follow the commitments made. Ghana welcomes the emphasis placed in this open debate on accountability as a preventative mechanism against conflict-related sexual violence, as it rightly directs our collective thinking to an essential truth. When an individual sexually violates another, long-lasting, indelible, and life-changing wounds are inflicted on the victim, which can only be purged if the perpetrator is held accountable and brought to justice. Without accountability, which is necessary to deter future violence, there is no closure for victims, and society is worse off in the efforts to rid itself of the culture of impunity associated with sexual violence. Mr. President, through the annual reports of the Secretary General, we are repeatedly reminded that conflict-related sexual violence comprises actions such as rape, sexual slavery, forced prostitution, forced pregnancy, forced abortion and forced sterilization, forced marriage, and many other forms of sexual violence of comparable gravity perpetrated against women, men, girls, or boys that is directly or indirectly linked to a conflict. This lengthy list of acts of sexual violence does not only paint a gory picture of the sheer atrociousness of acts perpetrated in the context of conflict, but also points to the multifaceted, diverse, and extensive nature of acts of sexual violence in conflict. It is therefore important that we elevate the discussion against the common perception that limits appreciation of the notion of sexual violence to rape by creating broader awareness of the breadth and extent of this menace if we are to succeed in ensuring the operationalization of global norms, including resolutions of this Council such as 2467 and other UN and international norms on the subject. Whenever sexual violence has been used as a reprisal tool or weapon of war, the path to accountability has often been fraught with enormous challenges. In many cases, survivors are not able to access the help required due to systemic or institutional obstacles, the fear of reprisals and stigmatization, as well as societal norms and cultural perceptions, among others. In much worse scenarios, help is completely unavailable. In almost all the conflict situations the Council is seized with, there are, in varying degrees, reports of sexual violence. The Council and the global community, therefore, have a continuing responsibility to ensure that the existing resolutions which champion prevention, accountability, and justice are translated into actions that can be felt on the ground. Mr. President, in making specific recommendations for today's debate, Ghana would like to focus on the following 3 points. First, we reaffirm support that the Council should ensure that conflict-related sexual violence is treated as a basis for targeted sanctions against culpable actors, and to see to it that sanctions committees have the requisite expertise on conflict-related sexual violence. Periodic briefings to the committees by the Special Representative on Sexual Violence in Conflict will be useful in sustaining the interest and reviewing progress on the implementation of such sanctions, as well as existing challenges. Member states are also encouraged to actively ensure the development and implementation of domestic legislation that enables investigation and prosecution of prosecutors of sexual violence in conflict settings to redress the wrongs done to their victims. Secondly, while Ghana commends the commitment demonstrated by the Council to deploy women's protection advisors as part of peacekeeping and special political missions to monitor, analyze, and report arrangements on conflict-related sexual violence in the field, we believe that the timely provision of adequate human and financial resources for this purpose will ensure that the Council receives even more frequent and reliable and accurate information from the ground in order to take required action on the conflict-related sexual violence. Lastly, in order to empower survivors, the UN, as well as organizations within member states, including civil society groups, should be intentional in their recruitment of survivors to be part of decision-making processes and advocacy mechanisms on sexual violence in order to meaningfully impact policy, legal processes, and implementation. And in this regard, we welcome this morning's information from the Special Representative of a champion appointed in one such regard. This form of empowerment helps survivors to re-establish a sense of control and agency, as well as recognize their own strengths and capabilities in resolving the challenge. In concluding, Mr. President, it is important to recall that the effects of conflicts on populations are innumerable. Whenever conflicts occur, innocent civilians are often exposed to unspeakable physical, mental, environmental, and economic damage with very little hope for restoration. When sexual violence is introduced into this already toxic cocktail, victims experience an agony most of us can never imagine. For this reason, inaction and indifference should be considered a real enemy within this Council. As we strive to fulfill our mandate to maintain international peace and security, we owe it to victims, potential victims, and survivors of conflict-related sexual violence all over the world to ensure that our actions ultimately lead to freedom from sexual oppression and accountability for acts of sexual violence. I thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Ghana for their statements, and I give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, I wish to thank you for convening this important debate on accountability as prevention. and ending cycles of sexual violence in conflict. I thank all briefers this morning, and I extend particular thanks to Special Representative Madam Pramila Patten and to Madam Nadia Murad for their enlightening briefings. In a global context marked by myriad unprecedented security, humanitarian, economic, political, or health crises, today's topic compels us to consider the fate of civilians, particularly that of women and children who pay the highest price in fragile contexts, conflict or post-conflict situations. Mr. President, the adoption in 2008 of Resolution 1820, underpinned by a robust normative framework, allowed Resolution 1325 to reverberate further. Particular emphasis was given to the need to put an end to sexual violence during armed conflict. These resolutions stood as a turning point in the perception of sexual violence as a security problem in its own right. We must note here that the myriad of conflicts and multifaceted crises exacerbate this horrific phenomenon of which women are among the first and primary victims. In this regard, the most recent report on the issue sheds light particularly on the cases of women peacebuilders and women human rights defenders who, in fragile contexts and during conflicts, are often the targets of sexual abuse, harassment, or of any other types of intimidation whose goal is to exclude them from public life. This staggering assessment makes it imperative for the international community, and particular for the members of this council, to rally their efforts in order to put an end to cycles of conflict-related sexual violence. Mr. President, my country, under the leadership of President Ali Bongo Ondimba, has resolved to place the well-being of women and youth at the heart of its development policy. My country recognizes the deep well of potential that women have in terms of security, stability, and finding a lasting peace. Consequently, Gabon remains steadfast in its call for accountability for the perpetrators of sexual violence. And moreover, we remain staunchly committed to advocating for inclusion, participation, and the strengthening of the resilience of women. Indeed, sustained commitment and the effective participation of women in conflict prevention and resolution processes, as well as in post-conflict recovery and peace-building processes, will allow us not only to achieve a lasting peace, but also to ensure that decisions issued as part of transitional justice processes are fairer and better adapted to the damage done to victims and to their expectations. And at the same time, we will be able to guarantee that we take into account important contextual factors. We remain convinced of the need to make more effort in order to facilitate survivors' access to justice and accountability mechanisms. This will mean that we can provide a holistic response to conflict-related sexual violence. Moreover, it is vital to facilitate access to redress, which is a key component in restoring the dignity of those concerned. At the same time, we must advocate a holistic preventive approach which is tailored to situations on the ground. We must use existing means and mechanisms also draw on security sector reform and guarantee the security of people and the increasing of their awareness. My country finally calls for the continuations of efforts underway to ensure the ownership and implementation of Resolution 1325 and its related resolutions, including Resolutions 1820 and 2467. We also call for the strengthening of the partnership between the UN and regional organizations, such as the African Union, namely, these organizations must work together to strengthen their work on the women, peace and security agenda. This is vital in order not only to find lasting solutions to conflicts and their negative effects, but such cooperation is necessary to ensure the broader consideration of gender dimensions in the mandates of UN peace missions. And this is particularly important in situations in conflict or post-conflict situations. In the same vein, we note with interest the action of the Network United Nations Action Against Sexual Violence in Conflict, UN Action. This initiative connects the efforts of 21 UN bodies in order to prevent conflict-related sexual violence and to respond to survivors' needs and to fight against impunity. Mr. President, it is high time that this Council issues a unanimous call in favour of the access of the victims of sexual violence to international justice. That is a guarantee of hope, dignity, and the restoration of fundamental rights. The denial of victims' justice is an aggravating factor and one which hinders their recovery. We are staunchly convinced that to better prevent and combat conflict-related sexual violence, we must ground our work in a survivor-centered approach, and we must focus on their protection and the strengthening of their resilience. All of this is vital because it is in healing the invisible wounds caused by wars and armed conflict. It is by providing victims with mental health care and psychosocial support that they need that we can turn the page and move once and for all towards achieving our common goal of a peaceful world for current and future generations. Thank you.
For her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Kenya.
Thank you, Mr. President. It is particularly fitting that Lord Ahmad should have chaired this debate earlier, given his role as the Prime Minister's Special Representative on Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict. We thank your delegation for bringing this important debate to the Council. I also thank SRSG Pramila Patten and the other briefers for their insights. Ms. Nadia Murad, thank you very much for your extraordinary bravery and determination and service to the Yazidi people, to women, and to all humanity with what you're doing. Kenya strongly condemns gender-based violence and its manifestation in all contexts, and as it takes place in the brutality and inhumanity of the conflicts in Syria, Ukraine, Ethiopia, and other wars. Mr. President, war itself is the crime that opens the door to the kinds of war crimes we're discussing today. War, even when it purports the opposite, and particularly when it's prolonged, almost inevitably leads to the breakdown of law, order, and moral conscience. We must redouble our efforts to prevent and stop war. We must be rid of the illusions of limited or precision-guided war, which in the last 20 years have shown their serious limits. We must turn our knowledge and experience of mediation to innovation and boldness of vision to stop the present wars. Thank you, Helena Berhanu, for your words and recommendations to the A3 and to the African Union. We hear and feel the pain of the Ethiopian people, and especially the suffering of the people of Tigray. We urge for cooperation and openness to mediation that enables full humanitarian access, ceasefire, and eventually to peace with justice. In the last year, the A3 has sought to stand with the people of Ethiopia as brother has taken arms against brother, and we will continue to do so. We have spoken up with strong recommendations. We have embraced the democratic aspirations of your country. We have urged humanitarian access and pushed for the Council's support for African Union and regional mediation. The A3 once in this chamber urged for ceasefire, observing that there is no lasting victory in crushing one's countrymen and countrywomen. I know this is still the position of the A3. As your neighbors and your brothers and sisters, we urge you on to embrace one another, to get beyond the intense suffering and pain that you're causing each other, and to reach for the peace that we all pray and hope for you. Mr. President, we're here in search of implementing commitments and existing frameworks. Kenya as a country has enacted strong laws and policies to combat sexual and gender-based violence, and we will champion the efforts in this chamber and outside it to continue to do so. Our focus for today is on sexual violence perpetrated by terrorist groups. The Secretary General's current report on conflict-related sexual violence underscores once again how sexual violence continues to be a tactic of war and terrorism. We are concerned that there is too little effort to ensure accountability for sexual violence perpetrated by terrorists. The Security Council should undertake strong efforts to list those responsible, including their chains of command. It should call for cases of sexual violence to be prosecuted within the context of terrorism. This should include the recommendation by Ms. Mariana Kakutli on sexual violence in prisons. We urge in that regard that the Security Council take steps to list and sanction administrators of prisons and their chain of command if their facilities are party to systemic and systematic sexual violence against prisoners. Mr. President, I'll propose 3 areas of action that I hope offer further opportunities for practical implementation. First, on member states' responsibility. States must escalate prosecution for gender-based violence and enhance efforts in preventing and responding to conflict-related sexual violence. All effort must be put to address stigmatization, discriminatory laws, and other cultural barriers that stand in the way of reporting and accountability. These should be reinforced by a gender-responsive and inclusive national security sector and the needed reforms to achieve it. Accountability and prevention demands localized identification of gaps and that communal infrastructure be operationalized for social awareness and sensitization programs, as well as access to justice mechanisms and medical and psychological care to the victims of sexual and gender-based violence. Secondly, on the role of the Security Council, we note that the current report underlines that the series of Council resolutions has helped to raise the cost of what has long been perceived as the cheapest and oldest weapon of war. We believe that the bar should be even higher. There is an urgent need to move from commitment to compliance, from resolutions to results. Beyond listings and incorporation of SGBV as a separate listing criterion in the relevant sanctions regimes, the Council should also take specific steps and deterrent measures to also increase the costs of acts of conflict-related sexual violence. Stronger integration and investment in the WPS, counterterrorism and countering violent extremism agendas will also contribute to increase the cost of those atrocities. For example, the implementation of Resolution 2242 of 2015, which recognizes the acts of sexual and gender-based violence are part of the strategic objectives and ideology of certain terrorist groups, including Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Al-Shabaab, and Boko Haram, should be linked to other resolutions that touch on countering terrorism, including 2354, 2178, and 2331. Third, on cross-border cooperation. The intersecting elements of rising militarization, coup d'etat, and conflicts with a transnational character call for enhanced coordinated action, especially where such contexts lead to increased refugee and IDP situations with potential aggravation of conflict-related sexual violence and human trafficking. We call for more effective cross-border coordination between border security personnel, early warning mechanisms, national and regional women's protection advisors, and humanitarian actors to minimize prevention and reporting gaps in alignment to Resolution 2467 of 2019 that speaks to cross-border dynamics. Given the importance of this cross-border and regional coordination, Kenya supports strategies for advancing implementation of the mandate and the integration of women, peace, and WPS positions into the UN annual budgets of peace operations, particularly during transition processes, in line with Resolution 2594. In this regard, Kenya looks forward to SRSG Patton's launch of her report in June. We also look forward to the international adoption of the Murad Code. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Kenya for their statements. And I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Marta Lucia Ramirez, Vice President and Minister for Foreign Affairs of Colombia. You have the floor.
Many thanks indeed, Mr. President. I'd also like to wish a very good afternoon to all permanent representatives of the members of the Security Council, as well as all of the briefers that are here with us today, everyone that's here with us today. In fact, I wish to extend particular gratitude to Pramila Patten for her briefing and her very comprehensive and unequivocal report on the Secretary-General's report on sexual violence in conflict. I also extend special greetings to Nadia Murad and thank her for her briefing. We have great admiration for her leadership and for her strength and for this capacity she has to bring people together. I'm also very grateful to Marina Kalkulitu for her briefing. And I wanted to say that you don't have to be a victim of conflict-related sexual violence to feel a moral obligation to speak out. Speak out to say that this is an atrocious crime, a crime that must see institutions as strong as they can be at a state level and elsewhere to tackle it. The multilateral system needs to be as strong as it can be to appropriately prevent and punish the crime. We need to be as strong as we can to ensure that there is no impunity. And this applies regardless of whether they're the terrorist groups, drug dealing groups, or criminals of any type that are perpetrating this crime, or whether we're talking about cases of sexual violence as part of war between states. We have to speak out with one voice at a national and international level. Nobody can claim the right to use the body of any human being as a chessboard on which to fight war. No one can say that they're above the law, and no one can say that a woman's body can be used as a theatre for war. And the multilateral system must be absolutely unequivocal in stating that fact. As a member of the Colombian government, I've worked alongside President Ivan Duque, who was here yesterday, to ensure that our country sets an example in everything that's related to preventing and tackling sexual violence in conflict, and ensuring that we set an example in terms of dealing with women and ensuring their rights and ensuring gender equality. Often, sexual violence against women in conflict is precisely the fruit of gender inequality. The cause of poverty in many nations is also gender inequality often. So what we have to achieve together is ensuring an equal playing field for women and men. Women need to have full access to a life where they can fully harness their potential and abilities and contribute to the economic development of their nations. Consequently, in Colombia, we have attached the utmost importance to the economic empowerment of women as part of our gender policy that I've been spearheading as part of Ivan Duque's presidency. Women need economic empowerment and autonomy because those women are much less vulnerable to any type of violence. We also know that this is a moment in which what the entire world is witnessing as a consequence of the pandemic, we're seeing those consequences, and we're also seeing the economic consequence of Russia's war against Ukraine. All of this situation globally indicates that there will be the progress made on poverty throughout the world will be undone. And this means that women need to have a much greater role to play in the economy, not a lesser role. They need a greater role, because if 50% of the population, that's women throughout the world, enter the labor market as entrepreneurs, if women can be business owners and if they have the support of states, the entire world will benefit from that human capital, which productively generates wealth and contributes to the creation of jobs. I say all of that, colleagues, because the women's cause is not one to be championed by women alone. It must be championed by humankind, by all nations. And that's particularly important in these difficult times that together we're all experiencing. And in light of all of the above, we welcome the recommendations made by the Secretary General that we've heard about through Pramila Patten. At this time, we need to be creative, and I also welcome the additional recommendations made in a very clear way, lucid way, by the delegation of Mexico. As far as we're concerned, we think that the best way of really preventing violence against women and sexual violence and conflict-related violence perpetrated against women is precisely by giving women greater economic autonomy and by allowing them to actively participate in the economies and also to raise their voice. And we have to support women with much more effective measures from within the multilateral system to ensure they can speak out, as many today and yesterday have. In Colombia, we believe that when national justice is not working, international justice actors have to intervene to deal with conflict-related sexual violence or violence that occurs outside conflicts. Often, we talk about whether something's an armed conflict or a conflict, or not, rather, and we deal with violence within those optics, but it doesn't really matter. We're talking about violence in any case which injures a woman's body. There's conflicts that have religious underpinnings, ethnic underpinnings, or drug trafficking related conflicts. There's a wealth of conflicts, but they all share the fact that there is sexual violence perpetrated within these conflicts. But whether we're talking about conflict related sexual violence or not, sexual violence needs to be dealt with, and in all cases international justice needs to intervene when national justice cannot, and when there isn't political will for national justice to function. All of this needs to be supplemented with other recommendations. We are convinced that we need to establish synergies between all parts of the multilateral systems and the United Nations when it comes to sexual violence. The UNDP, the IMO, UNHCR, UN Women, everything has to be joined together so that we can together pursue one goal, and that is preventing conflict-related sexual violence and avoiding violence against women. Another goal, of course, is to avoid impunity when violence does occur. For this reason, we believe that it is also vital that from within this Security Council we issue recommendations, for example, to the multilateral banks, because for there to be international justice for cases of sexual violence, there also needs to be conditions attached to loaning by the World Bank. So there cannot be any credits issued by the World Bank if we don't take into account sexual violence. Money can't be given to those that perpetrate violence against citizens and against women. That condition needs to be attached to the granting of finance. Colombia believes that there needs to be an economic autonomy index for women, because we know that countries are taking specific action to empower women, but we need to be able to measure what's being done. Yesterday, Ivan Duque explained very clearly that in Colombia we are implementing the agreement we established with the FARC. That agreement defined 51 indicators that are measured continuously. These 51 indicators, well, 50% of those have already been fully implemented. The goal of these indicators have been reached. Significant resources have been devoted to women-related projects. Often, women affected by conflict-related violence have received title deeds to land so that they can develop their productive projects. And our country has suffered a great deal as a result of drug trafficking. Of course, other countries have suffered from that scourge. Some 33,000 people in our country have been recorded as victims of sexual violence, and 30,000 of these, or thereabouts, are women. 90% of the victims of sexual violence in our country are women, and that means that they really are the primary victims of sexual violence in our country, and consequently economic and other forms of redress is often devoted to women. Regarding justice, which is very important, I want to indicate that where Colombia is concerned, the Attorney General has created a specialized body of attorneys specialized in sexual violence. Attorneys, prosecutors that have a wealth of training in working on sexual violence and gender-based violence issues. And that means that they can provide justice without re-traumatizing female victims of sexual violence, because but also we know women have unfortunately suffered from the scourge too. We are taking measures in that regard. Ivan Duque, for the first time, convened a National Security Council with the Army Chief of Staff and with the directors of National Police, with the Ombudsman, and that meeting analysed where things stood in terms of security and the risk of sexual violence being perpetrated against women. And that meeting prompted us to ensure that in 70% of our municipal authorities, we're developing a similar mechanism where the representative of public bodies and prosecutors are permanently working to identify cases of sexual violence and to ensure that there is no impunity when it comes to sexual violence perpetrated against women. These recommendations are ones we take due note of. But I would say that a number of the recommendations that have been issued are already being fulfilled and met by Colombia on its own initiative. But it is crucially important to strengthen recommendations issued by the Security Council so that we don't continue granting money and loans to countries where there isn't a robust agenda in place designed to guarantee gender equality and to eradicate sexual violence against women, and especially conflict-related sexual violence. That financing point is very important. Women must participate in public bodies. We've also devoted our energies to ensuring that women participate as soldiers, but also that they have senior leadership positions. It's very painful to hear that soldiers in Eritrea, female soldiers in Eritrea, are often the perpetrators of sexual violence. And it's tragic because no one can feel that they've got any right to perpetrate sexual violence against someone else in conflict. The report refers to 18 countries, the Secretary General's report, but I fear that many other countries are affected by sexual violence that aren't mentioned. And sexual violence in all of these countries is being used to demonstrate the supremacy of one group over another. It's also being used to dull the will of many people in societies to speak out or to participate in public life. So your work is very important. My deep gratitude to you, and we're ready and willing to fully cooperate with you on those issues where we've been spearheading our own initiatives. And for example, particularly important is bringing justice to remote rural areas. We need to go to women's houses and not waiting for women to be able to leave their homes one day in search of justice. That's where we've been working, for example, and we'd be happy to cooperate with you. Thank you for your leadership. You have the full commitment of Colombia to working on these issues, not only when it comes to implementing the final agreement that dealt with the conflict in our country, but our commitment to ensuring this topic doesn't fall off our agenda. Thank you.
For her statements. Now, let me remind all speakers to limit their statements to no more than 4 minutes. We are running tight with time, but I now give the floor to the representative of Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Distinguished colleagues, allow me at the outset to congratulate you on the UK's presidency of the United Nations Security Council for the month of April. And thank you for convening this timely meeting to discuss conflict-related sexual violence. I would like to thank the distinguished briefers for their invaluable service to the cause of combating conflict-related sexual violence and their contribution to the debate today. Mr. President, COVID-19 has exacerbated violence against women and girls, especially those in conflict. Conflict-related sexual violence is a tactic used often to target civilians, inflicting long-term trauma and humiliation, fracturing families and the social fabric, triggering displacement, and fueling armed actors' activities. Throughout the years, the role of peacekeeping missions has evolved and been modernized to adapt to new emerging challenges, such as the CRSV, a coordinated and comprehensive approach across civilian, military, and police components from strategic to operational levels is critical to peacekeeping missions to effectively prevent and respond to CRSV in the performance of their mandates. Training, mainstreaming policies against CRSV, enhancing monitoring and reporting mechanisms, and advocacy and raising awareness are crucial elements in any successful strategy to combat CRSV. Distinguished colleagues, Jordan, a host country of 2 million of refugees, had its already scarce resources strained. Nonetheless, through its response plan, we carried numerous outreach activities that have the objective of raising awareness, particularly among young people, to change social norms and promote gender equality, with a particular focus on the prevention of child marriage and ending sexual and gender-based violence. In addition, Jordan's YPS 2250 National Coalition has collaborated with UNFPA to organize an online interactive session to mobilize young people and representatives of youth organizations and networks on CRSV and discuss the impact of sexual violence on the lives of young people and their communities, as well as the effective tools to combat the phenomena. Gender-responsive security sector reforms remain crucial for the fulfillment of our mission to eliminate CRSV. As part of Jordan's National Action Plan, we managed to integrate gender-responsive training into the security sector. Mr. President, we must ensure that existing UN, international, and national mechanisms to combat sexual violence are supported and provided with the needed resources to support survivors and prevent future tragedies. Perpetrators of violence, whether state or non-state actors, must also be held responsible for their acts. States should harmonize their legislation to criminalize CRSV under the national laws and remove any procedural impediments for prosecution of the crimes, including forms of immunity like immunity ratione materia. CRSV must not be seen as an inevitable byproduct of the process. Effective implementation of criminal responsibility, criminal accountability, and international responsibility is an important deterrent for the commission of the crime. The well-being of survivors should be our focus in the efforts to reducing and preventing sexual violence, ensuring equal access to medical care and psychological support for all sexual violence survivors during conflict and in post-conflict situations is an integral part of the process. Distinguished colleagues, now is the moment to enhance our joint efforts to eliminate sexual violence in conflicts. We have a second chance to reset the rhythm in our endeavors to end conflicts around the world and build back better for our future generations, where every individual around the world would be able to realize their full potential. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Jordan for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Mr. President, I begin by thanking the UK for organising this open debate and today's briefers for enriching the discussion with their personal experiences and insights. Malta aligns itself with the statements to be delivered by the European Union and the group of Friends of Women, Peace and Security and the LGBTI core group, and would like to make some additional remarks in its national capacity. Mr. President, sexual violence and rape are terrifying weapons of war aimed at humiliating and stigmatizing helpless civilians. As members of the international community, we must strive to prevent these crimes, redouble our efforts to hold perpetrators accountable, and ensure that we support survivors. We must reject the notion that sexual violence and rape are unfortunate but inevitable consequences of war. They are not. They are war crimes. They are a breach of international law and must be treated as such. In Ukraine, reports of rape continue to increase. Several women and girls have recounted the sexual violence and abuse that they have suffered at the hands of Russian soldiers. I commend the courage of the many women who are sharing their chilling accounts of rape and other forms of sexual violence. What we are hearing by word of mouth, especially of survivors, is horrific. We cannot be silent in the face of such atrocities. Neither can we forget what has happened and continues to happen in other parts of the world. In Syria, Yemen, South Sudan, Nigeria, Democratic Republic of Congo, Afghanistan, Iraq, Ethiopia, Myanmar, Libya, and other places. Malta is concerned that children, particularly girls, are vulnerable to sexual violence at or on their way to school. We call on all parties to conflict to end and prevent sexual violence against children. Mr. President, conflict-related sexual violence is equally traumatizing yet different in nuance for women, girls, men, boys, and people with diverse sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression and sex characteristics. Justice and accountability must be crucial parts of our response, and more awareness is needed to promote accountability. Survivors must be kept at the center of our efforts. They must have access to resources to counter the multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination they face, while a more gendered psychological and medical support should be ensured. Special Representative Patton has once again pointed out to the fear and stigma that survivors face. Malta fully supports the mandate of the SRSG and commends the important work of her office. It is equally important for women and girls in all the diversity to enjoy full, equal, and meaningful participation and leadership at all levels of decision-making, as outlined in Security Council Resolution 1325. Providing all survivors with access to a holistic model of care covering medical, psychological, legal, and socioeconomic needs is a concrete way to empower women towards demanding their rights and creating change both within their countries and globally. There can be no impunity for those who violate human rights law and international humanitarian law. The ICC can contribute to the fight against conflict-related sexual violence by developing and consolidating a gender-responsive legal framework and jurisprudence. The capacity of governments, judiciary, police, military, and civil society should be further built to gather evidence and strengthen prosecutions. Training to military and police personnel, peacekeepers, grassroots organizations, and human rights defenders on sexual violence issues remains essential. In conclusion, by adopting a holistic approach, we need to save and protect, but also we hope that victims, given all the support for their recovery, are transformed into empowered survivors and agents of change within their communities. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for her statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Canada.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I speak on behalf of 64 member states of the Group of Friends of Women, Peace and Security. Our group is profoundly concerned by the persistent and widespread use of sexual violence with impunity by state and non-state actors in a great many conflicts around the world. The list of these conflicts is long, Mr. President, and it's been mentioned by several, including in the Secretary General's report. I think it's important that we bear them all in mind. I appreciated the comments from my colleague from Malta with respect to the situation in Ukraine. And we need to understand that the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has spoken of possible war crimes, breaches of international humanitarian law, and serious violations of international human rights laws. We strongly support the Secretary General's call for an immediate, independent investigation of the conduct of all those involved in the conflict. Mr. President, we call on all parties in all conflict situations to immediately cease all forms of sexual violence consistent with international law and with resolutions of the Security Council. Those responsible for such heinous acts must be held to account by national justice or, where that is not possible, international justice. Regrettably, for many victims and survivors, access to justice, remedies, and reparation is non-existent or painfully slow. UN member states must fight impunity through strengthening the rule of law. Our group strongly encourages the Security Council to incorporate and apply sexual violence as a designation criterion in UN-sanctioned regimes. We must redouble our efforts to dismantle all barriers that hinder survivors from safely reporting sexual violence and from accessing essential services, which include sexual and reproductive health care services, victim advocacy, mental health and psychosocial support, and legal services. We also reiterate the importance of ensuring universal access to sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights, as has been agreed in accordance with the Program of Action of the International Conference on Population and Development, as well as the Beijing Platform for Action. We call on all parties to ensure a safe and enabling environment for civil society, including women peace builders, women human rights defenders, to carry out their important work free of intimidation, free from violence, and free from reprisals. Mr. President, member states must invest in tackling the root causes of conflict-related violence. Prevention starts, we believe, with a commitment, first of all and foremost, to gender equality, with the empowerment of women and girls in diverse situations and conditions, the protection and promotion of human rights, and women's full, equal, and meaningful participation and leadership at all levels of decision-making. We encourage the Council to ensure that country mandates emphasize the prevention of conflict-related sexual violence and strengthen early warning systems through the deployment of women's protection advisors. Finally, it is critical that survivors remain at the heart of all of our efforts. We must recognize that survivors have different needs and may face multiple intersecting forms of discrimination. We must ensure that their rights are respected, that they're treated with dignity, that they're able to access justice, and that they can safely, fully, and meaningfully participate in decision-making at all levels. Monsieur le Président, permettez-moi brièvement.
Mr. President, allow me briefly to say a few words on behalf of my country, Canada. We are convinced that we need to continue to support the work of the ICC, and when the court does not have a purview, we will continue to explore the means of ensuring accountability for these crimes. Finally, experiences of all survivors, including those experiences of the LGBTI community, remind us of the need to do one thing and one thing alone, and that is to hear. Our work involves helping them to rebuild their lives, to restore their dignity through justice.
Moment, if I could. I had the opportunity to serve as the Prime Minister's Special Envoy to Myanmar and to Bangladesh. I came to the camp in Cox's Bazar 3 or 4 weeks after the forcible deportation of nearly 1 million people, many of them women and girls, most of them women and girls. I had the opportunity to speak to a great many women who had been the victims of sexual violence. Sexual violence is not about sex. It's about power, and it's about violence, and it's about the abuse of patriarchal power. The stories that I heard have been repeated, and luckily, fortunately, people have been able to tell them to a great many people who have gathered evidence and who are gathering evidence and presenting this evidence. Tragically, this experience is going to have to be repeated in country after country after country. We have to take every possible step to stop this terrible abuse. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Canada for his statements. There are still a number of speakers remaining on my list for this meeting, so I intend, with the concurrence of members of the Council, to suspend the meeting until 3 p.m. And I also thank the interpreters for keeping going until this time. The meeting is suspended.